Just as Han Li and the holy grey devilish ape were engaged in direct combat, Xianxia and the Azure Kirin projection had stopped before a black light barrier. Over 100 feet up ahead stood an inky black stone wall, and this was already the end of the passageway, so there was no way to progress any further. The Kirin projection hesitated momentarily before confirming, "This should be the place." "You better make sure this is the right place. The formation flags used to open the spirit cave are disposable objects, and I've only barely managed to refine one set," Xianxia said in a cautious manner. The Kirin projection cocked its head to the side in contemplation for a short while before nodding in agreement. "You're right, it's better to be safe than sorry. Wait for me for a moment." It then opened its mouth to expel an azure bead. The bead rotated on the spot before suddenly transforming into a burst of azure light that swept toward the stone wall up ahead. A peculiar scene then ensued. After the azure light disappeared into the stone wall, a low whistling sound suddenly rang out from within the stone wall mere moments later. Immediately thereafter, black light flashed from the stone wall, and the azure light was repelled out of it by some kind of immense force. Spiritual light flashed, and the azure light converged to form a bead again. "There's no mistaking it, this is definitely the place," the Azure Kirin projection said in an excited manner as it swallowed the bead again. After receiving confirmation from the miniature Kirin, Xianxia was also ecstatic, and she said, "All right, I'll set up the formation to open the spirit cave right away." Thus, she flipped a hand over, and a stack of azure formation flags that she'd prepared earlier appeared over her palm. These formation flags appeared to be rather mundane, but upon closer inspection, one would discover that their thin golden and silver lines embedded deep into the formation flags like layers of cobwebs. Xianxia flicked a wrist, and several tens of streaks of azure light shot forth before pausing mid-flight, then abruptly converging toward the center. In the blink of an eye, an azure formation that was several tens of feet in size appeared before disappearing into the stone wall up ahead in a flash. However, the stone wall displayed no reaction, as if nothing had happened. Xianxia seemed to have known this would happen in advance, and she wasn't disheartened in the slightest as she made a grabbing motion with both hands. A small blue bell appeared in one hand, while a white scepter appeared in the other. The bell was entirely translucent with a ball of blue liquid flashing with spiritual light within it, creating quite a vibrant sight to behold. In contrast, the scepter was rather antiquated with a dull surface, and there were even some parts of it that were damaged. Xianxia was clearly quite reluctant to part with these two treasures, but she still hurtled them through the air in unison. A ball of blue light and a ball of white light immediately flew forth at once before changing directions and suddenly crashing into one another. The two treasures then shattered like earthenware objects, and countless fragments shot forth in all directions. After the lights faded, two balls of liquid, one blue and one red, appeared in midair. A hint of greed flashed through the miniature Kirin's eyes upon seeing this, but it immediately repressed its impulsive urges. Even so, it still couldn't help but murmur, "The spirit blood of this octopede essence beast and undying bird cost you virtually all of the spirit stones you've saved up in the past few centuries, and even then, you were quite lucky to have been able to purchase them. After that, they were nurtured within these two treasures for over a century. If you were to consume them as is, they'd definitely be able to cleanse your essence and widen your meridians, and even my soul will benefit greatly from it. Us crystal beings are rather different from beings of other races, so consuming true spirit bloods will benefit me far less than what you think it will. Besides, these true spirit bloods are indeed quite precious, but they can't compare with the rewards awaiting us in the true spirit cave," Xianxia replied in a calm manner. You're not wrong there. You crystal beings do indeed possess rather unique constitutions, so it'll benefit you far more to secure the items in the true spirit cave. Using these true spirit bloods as a key to unlock this cave is unavoidable. After all, the two of us may be interconnected, but without true spirit bloods, we won't even be able to make the cave spirit reveal itself. For beings who aren't true spirits, it's extremely difficult to open this true spirit cave." The Kirin projection agreed with a chuckle. Xianxia merely smiled, and offered no reply as she flicked her 10 fingers through the air in rapid succession. A series of incantation seals shot forth from her fingertips, before disappearing into the balls of liquid in a flash. After absorbing these incantation seals, the two balls of liquid swirled before converging together to combine as one, thereby forming a ball of blue and red liquid. Xianxia pointed a finger up ahead, and the ball flew slowly toward the stone wall. The same whistling sound rang out from deep within the stone wall once again, following which azure light flashed from it, and the azure formation that had disappeared into it beforehand resurfaced. The runes within the formation surged, and a burst of azure light flew out from within to sweep up the ball of blue and red liquid. Immediately thereafter, the entire formation swayed before disappearing without a trace into the stone wall again. A solemn expression appeared on Xianxia's face upon seeing this, and she began to chant something while making a series of hand seals. On this occasion, the stone wall didn't fall silent as it did before. Instead, blue light suddenly began to swirl erratically over its surface, as if it had come alive. Immediately thereafter, the stone wall suddenly shattered layer by layer, following which a shimmering object flew out from within. This was a large face that had no other features aside from 2 eyes, a nose, and a large mouth, and it was impossible to tell the face's age. The face had its eyes closed as soon as it appeared, and it was completely still and silent. "Quick, now!" the Kirin projection hurriedly urged at the sight of this face of light. Xianxia also let loose a nervous cry as she made a hand seal, and the azure light formation appeared once again, only to vanish for the 3rd time in a flash. Thus, the only thing that remained hovering in midair was the ball of blue and red liquid. All of a sudden, the expression on the face changed slightly, and it slowly opened its eyes as if it had been awakened by the azure light formation, revealing a pair of pupils that were as black and bright as the night sky. It stared at the ball of blue and red true spirit blood before suddenly swallowing it whole. Blue and red light then flashed over the entire face as it put on a content and satisfied expression. After taking a glance at Xianxia, it opened its mouth, which then rapidly expanded to be around the same size as the entire face. Immediately thereafter, spiritual light flashed, and the face solidified into white stone. The gaping mouth also transformed into a white passageway that led downward on a sloped descent. "We've done it! The cave spirit is asleep. Let's go in right away," the miniature Kirin exclaimed with elation. Xianxia's face was also filled with unbridled excitement as she nodded before sweeping a sleeve through the air. The Kirin projection was swept up into her sleeve, following which she flew directly into the passageway. In the instant that Xianxia and the Kirin projection had entered the passageway, they'd failed to notice a discreet flash of crimson light in a certain corner. Moments later, a ball of golden light emerged from the devilish chi, then also flew into the white passageway. At the same time, a streak of crimson light shot forth from outside the mountain, following which a humanoid figure appeared at the entrance to the devilish chi passageway in a flash. This humanoid figure wore a suit of silver armor with a dark expression on his face, and it was none other than the man with the Gui surname. The restriction I set up earlier has been triggered, so those 2 beings really did come for True Spirit Cave. Good. I won't have to go the trouble of opening the cave on my own, then, the silver-armored man murmured with a cold expression on his face. Brilliant crimson light then erupted from his body as he flew directly into the passageway as a streak of crimson light. The crimson light that he had cultivated seemed to possess some mystical properties, as all of the surrounding devilish chi was repelled back as soon as it came into contact with the light, thereby allowing the man to enter the passageway with ease. Not long after he disappeared into the devilish chi, silver light suddenly flashed nearby, and a petite figure appeared out of thin air. It was none other than the female devilish beast, Ju Yi, and she was staring at the devilish chi passageway with astonishment etched on her face. The devilish chi here is so dense, only a few devilish beings are capable of conjuring up such powerful devilish chi. Could this be a secret cave abode belonging to Tai Mo or Zubai? The woman speculated to herself as she stood hesitantly on the spot, then stomped a foot onto the ground as she also flew into the passageway was a streak of azure light. As a high-grade devilish beast, the devilish chi in the area only further enhanced her powers, so she naturally didn't fear it in the slightest. Hanli stood in one corner of the hall with a shimmering golden head on each shoulder. At the same time, 4 golden arms had sprouted from below his ribs. The 4 arms were each holding a different weapon, respectively, a staff, a pestle, a wheel, and a ruler. The weapons were being held up in a crisscross formation in 2 groups of 2, and each group of 2 weapons was keeping a massive fist at bay. The 4 weapons were trembling incessantly while emitting a low, anguished ringing sound, as if they were being strained to a significant degree. Meanwhile, black chi was swirling around the pair of massive fists, and bursts of chi blasts were erupting from the fists from time to time. However, as soon as those blasts of chi struck the crystalline light barrier that stood before Han Li, they were refracted off to the sides, thereby failing to inflict any damage to Han Li. Further away in the distance, two fist-sized golden beetles were flying along in hot pursuit behind a purple blade segment. Every time the blade segment flashed through the air, a purple streak would hurtle forth to send one of the gold-devouring beetles flying for over 100 feet. However, the other gold-devouring beetle would then take advantage of the opportunity to approach the blade segment, thereby forcing it into retreat. The blade segment was capable of unleashing extremely powerful attacks, but it seemed to be unable to unleash two attacks in quick succession. Furthermore, it also seemed to be rather frail and wouldn't be able to withstand a collective attack from the two gold-devouring beetles. In contrast, the gold-devouring beetle that had been sent flying remained completely unscathed, and it merely set off in pursuit of the blade segment again in a fearless manner. The blade segment was more agile than the two gold-devouring beetles, and the purple streaks it unleashed were also extremely fast and unavoidable, but in the instant before it unleashed each slash, it would always have to pause for a split second. As such, even though the blade segment wanted to switch targets to attack Han Li, the two gold-devouring beetles would get in its way, taking its attacks with their bodies before chasing after it again. In the face of the devilish ape's fierce retaliation, the divine essence effused light and five-colored glacial flames that Han Li had set up were almost instantly destroyed. In the end, he was only barely able to withstand this round of attacks using the small crystalline shield. Not only was the devilish ape immensely powerful, the purple blade segment was also an extremely lethal weapon, and Han Li was having a very hard time coping with its attacks, even from afar. With his vast wealth of battle experience, Han Li naturally immediately decided that the best course of action available to him was to use his gold-devouring beetles to keep the blade segment at bay. Meanwhile, his body combined as one with the Provenant's true devil projection, and he conjured up a weapon for each of the 4 additional arms that he gained to oppose the giant ape's fists. At the same time, the two gold-devouring beetles struggled and thrashed with all their might to try and escape from the grasp of the giant ape. Following their mutation, the gold-devouring beetles had attained enormous strength, and they really were able to free themselves before immediately setting off in pursuit of the purple blade segment. Upon seeing this, the devilish ape swung its massive fists at Han Li and engaged him in melee combat. With Han Li's current immensely powerful body, he certainly wasn't going to back down from a physical brawl, and thus, the result of all that was the current situation. The devilish ape's armor and that purple blade segment were extremely powerful, but the fearsome aspect about it was its insane strength. Even though Han Li was using all 6 arms and activating his Provenant's true devil arts to its maximal extent, he was still being forced onto the back foot. However, perhaps the devilish ape didn't want to aggravate its existing injuries, or perhaps it had decided that its current attacks would be enough to take care of Han Li. In any case, it didn't unleash any additional abilities and only used its fists to attack him. As such, after growing accustomed to the giant ape's startling speed, Han Li was able to deal with its attacks in a composed manner. However, his treasures didn't do much to the devilish ape's purple armor, either, only leaving a few marks here and there. This suit of strange purple armor was like an indestructible turtle shell that encapsulated the giant ape's entire body, and even Han Li was finding it to be quite difficult to deal with. It appeared that he would have to devise some other type of strategy. Han Li's expression remained completely unchanged, but countless thoughts were racing through his mind. All of a sudden, he took a deep breath before extending a hand that was as pristine white as jade out of his sleeve. 5 white skulls then emerged from his fingertip before opening their mouths in unison to send a wave of 5-colored glacial flames surging toward the devilish ape. Immediately thereafter, Han Li opened his mouth to expel a small azure cauldron, and countless azure threads shot forth from within cauldron, hurtling directly toward his opponent. Meanwhile, a loud thunderclap erupted from behind Han Li, following which a pair of wings appeared on his back. He flapped those wings gently, and his body shot forth toward the exit of the hall as an arc of azure and white lightning. He was planning to unleash these opportunities to keep this devilish ape at bay for now, then fly back to open up some distance between them. After that, he was going to lure the devilish ape into the passageway, where the spring-dawn sword formation had been set up earlier. Only with the power of the sword formation would he be able to trap and kill this devilish beast. However, an extremely alarming turn of events suddenly unfolded. Azure and white lightning flashed, following which Han Li appeared before the only exit, only for a burst of crimson light to flash right beside him in the same instant. Immediately thereafter, a crimson object that was several tens of feet in length appeared out of thin air, then crashed down toward him with devastating might. It was none other than the crimson bed that the devilish ape had been lying on before. Han Li was naturally quite startled by the sudden emergence of this crimson bed, and he cast his gaze toward it to find that the entire bed was radiating brilliant crimson light. At the same time, runes of different sizes were surging from the bed in a frenzy, giving it quite a menacing appearance. Han Li naturally didn't dare to take the bed lightly, and he let loose a low cry almost in a reflexive manner. His 4 golden arms all swung their weapons upward in unison to form a barricade, while his 2 hands, one black and one white, also sent countless fist projections hurtling toward the bed. The treasure had appeared far too abruptly for him to be able to unleash any other abilities, so he could only oppose it with his body alone. Even so, he was confident that the combined powers of his 6 arms would be enough to send this bed flying. Thus, golden light flashed as the 4 weapons struck the crimson bed, and golden and crimson light intertwined amid a resounding boom. However, the bed only faltered for an instant before slowly continuing on its descent. Han Li's expression darkened, and the fist projections he'd unleashed suddenly converged to form a pair of massive head-sized fists, one black and one white, both of which also flew up toward the crimson bed. However, right at this moment, Han Li was suddenly struck by a bone-chilling sensation, and goosebumps appeared all over his body without any premonition. He didn't know what kind of dangers were present, but he'd always been extremely confident in his instincts. As such, he immediately withdrew his 2 hands before pointing toward the crystalline shield up ahead. The shield had already shrunk down to its original size, and he was trying to activate it against while making a hand seal to summon some other incantation seal. However, it already seemed to be too late. All of a sudden, a thin white line appeared directly behind Han Li, and a crimson arm with sharp hook-like fingers reached out from within. The shimmering golden layer of protective spiritual light and Han Li's immensely powerful body were punctured like mere papier-mâché structures before the arm emerged out the front of his chest. Han Li stared at the arm protruding out of his chest, and his facial muscles spasmed as a glazed-over look appeared in his eyes, as if he were unable to believe what had just happened to him. The giant ape's cackling reverberated throughout the entire hall again, but the voice wasn't coming from the devilish ape within the suit of purple armor. Instead, it was emanating from the spatial rift behind Han Li, so it was clearly coming from the owner of the crimson arm. "You dare to try and kill me, little brat. You're asking to be killed. I can see you have some very pure magic power in your body. You'll be perfect sustenance for me." A crimson shadow emerged from the spatial rift while chortling with glee. Immediately thereafter, the arm that had punctured through Han Li's chest drew back, and it opened its mouth bite off Han Li's head. However, right at this moment, an incredible turn of events abruptly unfolded. Han Li's body was suddenly enshrouded within a ball of green spiritual light before disappearing as specks of green light. What remained around the crimson arm was nothing more than a punctured green talisman. As such, the giant ape's mouth naturally chomped down onto thin air, and it was quite startled by this development before immediately turning toward the exit of the hall. Within the devilish chi outside the exit, green light flashed, and Han Li appeared with a slightly pale complexion. The crimson shadow turned its attention to his chest and was surprised to find that it was completely unscathed. If it weren't for the fact that a large hole had been torn into his azure robes there, the crimson shadow would have been led into thinking that it had fallen under the effects of an illusionary technique. The crimson shadow then turned toward its own arm to find that a shimmering green talisman had been punctured in Han Li's place. Its expression changed slightly as it reached out toward the talisman with its other arm, but right at this moment, Han Li harumphed coldly before uttering the word, "Return." The green talisman swayed before transforming into a streak of green light, which then disappeared into Han Li's body in a flash. This talisman was naturally none other than the spirit-form talisman that Han Li had been nurturing day and night within his body, ever since he'd arrived in the spirit realm. Taking into account Han Li's current cultivation base and the fact that the talisman had been nurtured for several hundred years, it was naturally far more potent than it was back in the human world. As such, in the instant that the crimson shadow's claws were about to puncture his body, he activated the spirit form talisman so it could take that lethal attack in his stead. If it weren't for his quick thinking, even if he could have escaped from that surprise attack alive due to his powerful body, he would have definitely sustained severe wounds. However, he wouldn't be able to use this spirit form talisman anytime soon. It would have to be nurtured within his body again for at least a century. At present, Han Li was more concerned about just what this crimson shadow was, and why it had appeared here in this place of slumber for this devilish ape. From what it had just said earlier, it was referring to itself as the same being, so could it be an avatar of the devilish ape, S? Han Li wore a rather bewildered expression, and he cast his gaze toward the crimson shadow with blue light flashing through his eyes. Even though the crimson shadow was enshrouded within a layer of crimson light, thereby making its body appear rather blurry and indistinct, Han Li was able to see just what it was with great clarity through the use of his spirit eye ability. The sight that he was greeted by immediately made his pupils contract drastically, as he discovered that aside from the fact that the crimson shadow appeared to possess no substantial body, it was completely identical in appearance to the devilish ape within the suit of purple armor. It had the same 3 horns, the same mouthful of sharp fangs, and the same pair of extremely long arms that extended past its knees. Seeing as Han Li was standing rooted to the spot with a hesitant look on his face, the crimson shadow turned to him with a sinister smile before waving a hand toward the armored devilish ape from afar. The giant ape immediately strode toward the crimson shadow, which disappeared into the ape's body as a streak of crimson light. A burst of black and red devilish chi swept forth from within the purple suit of armor, following which a burst of unfathomable spiritual pressure erupted directly into the heavens. Spiritual pressure of such astonishing potency was certainly not something that should belong to a severely wounded body integration stage being, and Han Li's expression changed drastically as he took several steps backward. At the same time, a thought suddenly occurred to him, and he recalled a devilish secret technique that was recorded in the heaven-bearing devil arts. You're using the body and soul division technique. How do you know the name of this secret technique? Indeed, I am using this technique to aid in my recovery. Splitting up my body and soul incurs a certain level of risk, but it speeds up my recovery by 2-fold. Come to think of it, you're a rather strange being. You're clearly a spirit realm being, yet you've mastered the top-rate devilish arts of our elder devil realm. Even though it's been heavily adjusted to suit a being like you, much of its power has still been retained, the devilish ape mused in a cold voice. Does that mean you're close to a full recovery already? Han Li's expression instantly darkened significantly. Haha, my body is recovering a little slowly, but my soul is almost fully recovered. If you know what's good for you, you'll come over here and let me suck away your blood. Perhaps if I'm pleased with the taste, I'll release a wisp of your soul so you can reincarnate yourself in the next life. The devilish ape cackled with mirth. Li contemplated the devilish ape's words for only a brief moment before he chuckled coldly as he said, "Your soul is almost fully recovered. Do you really think I'll believe that? You're a mid-holy race being, yet you're using your body to attack me while using your soul to unleash a sneak attack. If your soul really were almost fully recovered, why would you resort to such sneaky tactics? Your soul may be recovering at a faster rate than your body, but it's certainly nowhere near fully recovered. I may not be a match for you in your current state, but if I gather a couple of helpers to oppose you together, we'll be able to kill you with ease." The giant ape's cackling drew to an abrupt halt upon hearing this, and it suddenly made a grabbing motion as toe balls of crimson light flashed from its suit of armor. The purple blade segment that was battling the 2 gold-devouring beetles immediately disappeared, and in the next instant, it appeared in the devilish ape's hand, following which it swelled to become a giant purple sword that was around 10 feet in length. The giant ape slashed the sword toward Han Li several times in quick succession, and 7 or 8 thick purple streaks instantly hurtled toward him. However, Han Li was already prepared in advance, so he certainly wasn't going to fall prey to this attack. The crystalline shield before him radiated bright spiritual light, and it swelled drastically in size to form a translucent light barrier before him. The purple streaks struck the crystalline light barrier amid a string of resounding booms, and most of their powers were nullified by the light barrier. However, a small portion of its power still managed to bypass the light barrier before crashing directly into Han Li's body. Han Li made no effort to ward off the residual power of the purple sword streaks, and as such, his body was blasted into the devilish chi behind him like a cannonball. "You sure dare to talk big. You think you can threaten me with your pathetic powers. Where do you think you're going?" The devilish ape initially cackled in a derisive manner. However, after waiting for a short while for Han Li to re-emerge from the black mist to no avail, it finally realized something, and it also rushed into the devilish chi as a gust of devilish winds. However, as soon as the devilish ape entered the black chi, a small mountain that was around 10 feet tall suddenly came crashing down toward it. The devilish ape faltered slightly before merely raising a fist in a nonchalant manner to combat the oncoming small mountain. A burst of enormous power was instantly sent hurtling upward, and the devilish beast paid no further heed to the small mountain as it cast its gaze directly up ahead. To normal beings, there was zero visibility within this inky black devilish chi passageway, but for a holy grade devilish beast, it was as clear as day. As such, it immediately caught sight of Han Li, who was standing on the spot several hundred feet away. He was making a series of hand seals that was causing the surrounding devilish chi to tumble and surge violently, as if he were preparing to unleash some kind of extremely powerful ability. Despite the fact that it had caught sight of Han Li, the devilish ape didn't immediately rush toward him. Instead, it cast its gaze toward the area around him, acting in a rather cautious manner. However, in the next instant, an unexpected turn of events unfolded above its head. The immensely powerful force it had unleashed with its punch earlier had only caused the small mountain to wobble slightly, rather than knocking the mountain away as he'd expected. Immediately thereafter, the small mountain suddenly sped up in its descent. At the same time, it swelled rapidly to several times its original size, crashing down toward the devilish ape's head in a flash. The giant ape faltered slightly upon seeing this, but it then immediately let loose a cold harumph before slashing its huge purple sword through the air. Several purple streaks instantly took shape before converging to form a thick sword streak. The devilish ape was preparing to slice this small mountain in half in one fell swoop. However, it had reacted too late, and gray light suddenly flashed from the small mountain before it vanished on the spot. As such, the purple sword streak naturally missed its target, and the devilish ape was left feeling rather bemused as it pondered just what Han Li's intentions were. However, in the next instant, it suddenly seemed to have sensed something as it hurriedly lowered its head to cast its gaze up ahead again. There, he discovered that countless thin arcs of golden lightning had appeared and were revolving around his body. These arcs of lightning then gradually thickened before erupting from in all directions, slowly forming an astonishing spherical net of electricity. At the same time, a series of shimmering golden runes rushed out of Han Li's hands in quick succession, then disappeared into the arcs of lightning around him. In the instant that these runes disappeared into the arcs of lightning, the latter shattered soundlessly in unison to form a shimmering golden halo with a diameter of several tens of feet. Han Li's body became quite blurry and indistinct as he stood within the halo, but his chanting didn't cease for even a single moment. The golden halo began to revolve around him, and the golden runes churned erratically while releasing a faint ringing sound that was gradually becoming extremely sharp and piercing. Following an earth-shattering thunderclap, the halo abruptly vanished amid a flash of brilliant golden light, and Han Li reappeared with a ball that appeared to have been forged from pure gold hovering around a foot above one of his hands. The surface of the ball was riddled with runes, but it was completely dull and lusterless, releasing no spiritual pressure whatsoever, as if it were just an ordinary metal ball. However, the devilish ape immediately shuddered at the sight of the ball, and it exclaimed, "That's a devil-bane lightning bead." Immediately thereafter, it rushed toward Han Li as a gust of black and red devilish winds, seemingly desperate to get to Han Li before he could unleash the power of the golden ball. However, even after the devilish ape had rushed over 100 feet toward Han Li, he still remained completely motionless and displayed no reaction. All of a sudden, golden light flashed from the ground below, and two swords surfaced from the ground alongside a saber. The three weapons slashed through the air, sending two sword projections and a saber projection flying directly toward the giant ape. Even before the three projections had struck their target, a bone-chilling aura emanated from them, indicating that they were extremely sharp and destructive. The devilish ape is extremely confident in the suit of armor that it was wearing, but it naturally wouldn't allow itself to be struck by these attacks for no reason. As such, it immediately paused before three purple streaks erupted from within the devilish winds, destroying the three projections with ease. However, the gust of devilish winds decelerated slightly as a result, and at this moment, a cold smile suddenly appeared on Han Li's face. In the next instant, the devilish ape suddenly felt its surroundings blur, following which countless azure lotus flowers appeared from the four walls of the passageway, each of which was around a foot in size. Immediately thereafter, the lotus flowers combined to form an azure light barrier that enshrouded Han Li within. The holy grey devilish ape had rushed headfirst into Han Li's springed-on sword projection, and Han Li certainly wasn't going to squander such a brilliant opportunity to trap it. At this moment, the golden saber and swords that had emerged from the ground suddenly disappeared, and at the same time, a faint golden light flashed from Han Li's shadow, following which a pair of golden-armored warriors appeared. One of them was wielding a pair of long and thin swords, while the other was holding a single saber. These were none other than the two puppets formed by the armor origin talismans. The devilish ape was quite surprised to have found itself in this sword formation, but it wasn't overly panicked. Instead, it merely murmured to itself, "A sword formation, eh? That's rather annoying." At this moment, a cold light flashed through Han Li's eyes, and he activated the might of the sword formation to its maximal extent. The devilish ape was greeted by the sight of azure light flashing all around it, following which giant azure logs appeared out of thin air up above, then crashed down in a torrential downpour. The giant ape harumphed coldly upon seeing this, and crimson light flashed from its visor before it disappeared to reveal a set of sinister facial features. Within its huge eyes, there was a pair of shimmering balls purple light, and if one were to look closely, they'd discover that there were 5 colored runes flashing incessantly within the purple light. After removing its visor to reveal its eyes, the devilish ape looked up at the descending azure logs with a derisive sneer on its face. It reached up and made a grabbing motion toward one of the plummeting azure logs, paying no heed to the other descending logs around it. An incredible scene then ensued amid a resounding boom. A shimmering and translucent massive hand appeared in the air above, swatting aside the other logs before grabbing onto a completely mundane-looking azure log. Purple light then flashed from the 5 fingers of the giant hand, upon which the azure log transformed into an extremely sharp flying sword that was around a foot in size. In the instant that the illusionary technique around the flying sword was destroyed, all of the giant azure logs raining down from above vanished amid flashes of spiritual light. As for the azure flying sword, it was whizzing around incessantly within the massive translucent hand, trying to break free with all its might. A sinister look appeared on the devilish ape's face, and it slashed its giant purple sword directly toward the azure flying sword. The ape had identified that this flying sword had to be Han Li's bonded treasure, so if he could destroy it, then he'd be inflicting severe harm on Han Li by extension. Han Li was rather surprised that the illusionary technique within his sword formation was broken so easily, but his expression immediately darkened at the sight of what the giant ape was doing, and he certainly wasn't going to allow it to have its way. If this were an azure bamboo cloudswarm sword that hadn't been refined the second time, then it would indeed be in an extremely dire situation if it were to be captured by a far more powerful foe. However, having attained the void form ability, it was a simple task to convert the flying sword into an insubstantial form. Thus, Han Li merely pointed a finger at the flying sword within the sword formation, and it instantly vanished amid a flash of azure light. In the next instant, specks of azure spiritual light appeared over 100 feet away before converging to form the azure flying sword again. The sword then disappeared from within the sword formation in a flash. The devilish ape was slightly taken aback by this development, but a vicious look then flashed through its eyes as it abruptly made a hand seal. As it did so, the purple light radiating from its eyes became extremely dazzling and bright, and the 5 colored runes deep within its pupils scanned through the area relentlessly. In the end, its gaze settled on Han Li, who was standing outside the sword formation, and his immediately sank as he confirmed his earlier suspicions. This holy gray devilish ape possessed a spirit eye ability that was similar to his bright-sight spirit eyes. As such, it was able to immediately see through the sword formation's illusionary technique, then identify his location with ease. Just as these thoughts were racing through Han Li's mind, the devilish ape let loose a low snarl as it opened its mouth. A ball of black and red essential chi was expelled from within before enveloping the giant purple sword before it. Brilliant purple light immediately began to radiate from the sword, and the unknown creature within it suddenly swelled in size. It then emerged from the surface of the giant sword, thrashing about in a menacing display. The giant sword then twisted around so that its blade aimed directly at Han Li, following which it came crashing down with devastating force. A purple sword projection that was over 100 feet in length surged forth, slicing through the azure light barrier in a soundless manner. The sword projection should have hurtled through the air at an alarming speed, yet it was extremely slow and sluggish for some reason. Han Li's expression changed drastically upon seeing this, and his four golden arms made hand seals in unison before pointing toward the sword formation. Four pillars of dense golden light shot forth toward the purple sword projection, and a string of resounding booms rang out in quick succession. The pillars of golden light exploded with astonishing force, but they only stalled the purple light slightly before they were vanquished with ease. Thus, the purple sword projection continued to fly toward Han Li. Han Li's eyelids twitched upon seeing this, and the two shadow puppets behind him immediately slashed their weapons through the air at his behest. Golden sword projections and saber projections surged forth like a torrential downpour, and at the same time, Han Li abruptly injected a burst of magic power into his sword formation. Large azure runes instantly appeared on the azure light barrier up ahead, and these runes swirled before forming a series of azure lotus flowers in front of the light barrier. There seemed to be no end to the sword and saber projections unleashed by the two golden shadow puppets, but all of them destroyed by the purple sword projection with ease, unable to pose any obstacle to it. In the end, the purple light struck the barrier of azure lotus flowers, and the sword projection took on a form that was identical to the unidentifiable creature within the purple blade segment. The projection then pounced down in a vicious manner, easily tearing through the azure lotus flowers with its claws in a seemingly unstoppable manner. Han Li's eyes narrowed upon seeing this, and the magic power within his body instantly poured forth into the sword formation like a surging waterfall. The fragments of the azure lotus flowers that had been torn apart all converged to form more lotus flowers that stood in the path of the purple projection again. The purple projection was indeed extremely powerful, but the spring-dawn sword formation was certainly nothing to be scoffed at either. With the massive influx of spiritual power being provided by Han Li, countless azure lotus flowers surged forth in a frenzy from all directions. In the end, purple projection finally exhausted all of its power and vanished around 10 feet away from the azure light barrier. A hint of surprise flashed through the devilish ape's eyes upon seeing this. It was well aware of just how immensely powerful the purple blade segment was, and it was exactly because of this treasure that it had been hunted by multiple powerful beings, thereby reducing it to such a sorry state. Even though the limitation of its cultivation base meant that it wasn't able to unleash the treasure's full power, he had poured forth all of his magic power into that slash, and it was quite astonished that the sword formation had been able to withstand it. This indicated that the sword formation it had been trapped in was far more powerful than it had initially thought. In this current situation, it really wouldn't be able to break out of this formation easily. Come to think of it, one really did have to feel sympathetic toward this giant ape, which was extremely renowned even among holy-grade devilish beasts. Ever since it had crossed into this realm through the spatial rift in the Golden Devil mountain ranges, it had been forced into several fierce battles against both the holy-grade devilish beasts within these mountain ranges, as well as the holy race beings outside of it. Not only had its cultivation base been severely damaged as a result of these battles, it had almost perished on a few occasions, and several of the extraordinarily powerful treasures it had once possessed had also been destroyed. Otherwise, even in its current state, it would have still been able to force its way out of this sword formation had it still retained those powerful treasures. However, in this current situation, the devilish ape had no choice but to pause and ponder a viable course of action. The pressure on Han Li was eased significantly as a result, and he rustled his sleeve to produce a stack of talismans that were shimmering with azure light. These talismans all appeared to be completely identical. Each of them was around half a foot in length, and they were all emitting extremely pure wood attribute spiritual qi. At this moment, Han Li was finally able to confirm that this devilish ape was indeed far from its peak. Not taking into account its powerful spiritual sense and the various secret techniques it had mastered, its magic power was only comparable to a being at the pinnacle of the late spatial tempering stage. However, that suit of armor and the purple blade segment it was wielding were certainly not to be taken lightly, so it would still be an extremely difficult task to try and kill it. Thankfully, Han Li was able to restrict its movement techniques with his sword formation, but the fact that the giant ape possessed a spirit eye ability made it a troublesome opponent, nonetheless. It was most likely the case that the normal illusionary technique conjured up by the sword formation would be completely ineffective against this devilish ape. Han Li had envisioned this situation back when he first began cultivating this sword formation, and he conducted research into tactics against enemies with spirit eye abilities. As such, he developed some new abilities based on the Spring Dawn sword formation, and this holy gray devilish beast was the ideal lab rat for him to experiment with those abilities. With that in mind, Han Li took advantage of the devilish ape's hesitation to raise a hand into the air, and the stack of azure talismans instantly shot forth as streaks of azure light, then disappeared into the sword formation in a flash. At the same time, Han Li began to chant something, and his other hand gently raised the golden bead into the air, which then abruptly shot forth into the air above the sword formation as a pillar of golden light. Immediately thereafter, a massive golden rune shot forth from within into the air above, then vanished on the spot. The devilish ape within the sword formation instantly sensed something, and it looked up with a dark expression. A resounding boom rang out as fierce winds were swept up in the air above the sword formation. Dark clouds then began to gather, and a golden sun was barely visible through the clouds. A devastating aura that threatened to destroy heaven and earth was emanating from the golden sun, and countless arcs of lightning were flashing erratically over its surface. At the same time, a continuous string of dull thunderclaps rang out, creating quite a menacing atmosphere. "That's the lightning wheel technique," the devilish ape murmured to itself as the 5-colored runes flashed within its eyes. It then harumphed coldly as it waved a hand toward the giant purple sword up ahead, which instantly returned to his grasp as a streak of purple light. The giant ape then raised the sword as it prepared to slice through the golden sun up above. Divine Devilbane lightning was already extremely potent against devilish chi, and now that it had been enhanced by the lightning wheel technique, the giant ape definitely didn't want to withstand an attack from it, even with the suit of armor that it was wearing. However, before the ape even had a chance to swing its giant sword through the air, brilliant azure light suddenly flashed around it, following which its surroundings blurred, and in the next instant, it found itself in a lush azure forest. There were massive trees that were several hundreds of feet tall around, yet the devilish ape merely activated its spirit eye ability as it cackled. HMPH, that's a nice little party trick. However, before it had a chance to find a chink in the illusionary technique with its spirit eyes, all of the giant trees around it suddenly began to radiate azure light. They then twisted and warped before transforming into huge azure-armored warriors that were each around 100 feet tall. Immediately thereafter, azure light flashed in the air above, and all of the armored warriors made grabbing motions as a variety of weapons appeared in their hands, including the likes of sabers, swords, axes, and halberds. The dozen or so armored warriors that were situated closest to the devilish ape raised their weapons before bringing them down without any hesitation, sending a dozen or so massive black shadows hurtling toward it amid gusts of fierce winds. The devilish ape was given quite a fright by this sudden development, and it had no choice but to ignore the divine Devilbane lightning for now as it slashed its giant sword through the air. A purple streak instantly fanned out in a circular formation, and the dozen or so huge blades were all destroyed, along with the armored warriors in the surrounding area. Wait, these things aren't entirely projections. As opposed to being elated by how easily it was able to vanquish these armored warriors, the devilish ape was instead quite bewildered. When the purple streak had sliced through the giant weapons, he could clearly sense that they had been imbued with a lot of spiritual power. However, before the devilish ape had a chance to make sense of the situation, rumbling footsteps rang out in all directions around it, and more armored warriors rushed toward it in a frenzy, brandishing their giant weapons along the way. The devilish ape harumphed coldly, yet on this occasion he didn't use his purple sword to retaliate. Instead, he stomped a foot heavily onto the ground, and an earth-shattering boom rang out as black and red shockwave proliferated outward in all directions. The armored beings that were struck by this shockwave tumbled to the ground, and they were all eradicated in the blink of an eye. Han Li's expression darkened upon seeing this, and he suddenly switched to another hand seal. All of a sudden, countless specks of azure light appeared out of thin air before transforming into azure arrows, each of which was around a foot in length. Letter 1D5F3, letter 1D69B, letter 1D6AT, letter 1D6AT, letter 1D604, letter 1D556, letter 1D5F0, letter 1D560, letter 1D46. The arrows whistled through the air, hurtling toward the giant ape in a torrential downpour. However, the devilish ape wasn't flustered in the slightest this time. It merely patted its suit of purple armor, and a purple light barrier emerged from it. After doing that, it narrowed its eyes as it unleashed its spirit eye ability before looking up at the oncoming azure arrows. However, it then furrowed its brows, and a hint of confusion appeared on its face. His spirit eye ability told him that all of these arrows were imbued with spiritual power, and none of them were mere projections. Before the devilish ape could make sense of the situation, the oncoming barrage of arrows struck the purple light barrier before exploding like fireworks. The light barrier tremored and flashed erratically in the face of this downpour of arrows, but it remained completely stalwart and unmoved. The devilish ape was quite relieved to see that even though these arrows weren't projections, they weren't all that powerful either. However, at the same time, he couldn't help but speculate about what Han Li's intentions were. Right at this moment, a resounding boom suddenly erupted from the ground beneath its feet, following which a giant azure hand emerged before crashing down toward the devilish ape with mountainous force. The giant ape naturally wasn't going to back down, and it raised its huge sword in preparation to slice the massive hand in half. However, it suddenly seemed to sense something, and it abruptly raised its head, just in time to see a golden pillar of light crash down from the golden sun formed by the divine devil-bane lightning. The pillar of golden light descended in a completely soundless manner, but it reached the devilish ape in a flash, and the ape's expression instantly changed drastically. Brilliant purple light erupted from the devilish ape's body, instantly fortifying the purple light barrier and making it around twice as thick as before. At the same time, it completely ignored the giant azure hand as it hurriedly raised its massive sword above its head to act as a shield. In the next instant, the golden pillar of light struck the giant sword amid a resounding thunderclap, and the sword shuddered as countless arcs of lightning dispersed like cobwebs. The devilish ape felt an immense weight crash down onto its hands, as if a giant mountain had crashed down onto its sword, and even it was struggling to withstand this enormous weight, despite its incredible strength. The divine devil-bane lightning enhanced by the lightning wheel technique was far more powerful than it had anticipated, and there seemed to be no end to the pillar of golden lightning crashing down from above, thereby placing it in an extremely bothersome situation. The devilish beast was extremely stunned by the power of Han Li's attack, and it abruptly drew in a sharp breath. A ball of black and red chi then surged forth from its dantian before dispersing through its meridians. A string of explosive cracks and pops then rang out from all over the devilish ape's body, and it swelled drastically in size. At the same time, its arms also became noticeably thicker following a flash of black and red spiritual light. The giant purple sword that it was barely able to hold onto was immediately stabilized as a result, yet the grim expression on the devilish ape's face indicated that it was only just able to hold on. Right at this moment, the giant azure hand that had emerged from the ground came crashing down, threatening to crush half of the ape's body beneath it. However, the devilish ape paid no heed toward it. On one hand, it had its suit of purple armor to protect itself, so an attack manifested from a mere illusion certainly wasn't going to be able to harm it. On the other hand, it really no spare capacity to do anything else as it focusing entirely on withstanding the threat of the divine devil-bane lightning. At present, it was gnashing its fangs together as it relentlessly circulated devilish chi within its body, and all it wanted to do was withstand this divine devil-bane lightning first. The devilish ape knew that he lightning-wielded was extremely powerful, to the extent that it would have been susceptible to the technique even at the height of its powers. However, the technique was also quite troublesome to unleash, so as long as it could endure this round of attacks, there definitely wouldn't be a second round. However, in the instant that the massive azure hand came into the contact with the purple light barrier, the devilish ape didn't actually adopt no defensive measures against it. The light barrier swayed and manifested a shield of light that stood in the path of the giant hand, but after hearing a crisp crack that indicated something had shattered, the ape knew that it had still underestimated the attack. It hurriedly tried to unleash some other abilities, but it was already too late. A burst of enormous force shattered the light shield with ease, then struck the devilish ape's body, and even the suit of purple armor that it was wearing couldn't nullify much of the impact. The giant ape was focusing all of its power on resisting the pillar of lightning crashing down from above, and despite its immensely powerful body, it was unable to stand still any longer after being struck by this unexpected attack from the side. Thus, its massive body was sent flying, and only then did the azure hand reveal its true form. It was none other than the divine essence-effused mountain. The treasure had already been refined by Han Li, to the extent that it was virtually an extension of his body, and he was able to swindle the devilish ape using the sword formation's illusionary techniques as a smokescreen. The devilish ape did indeed possess a spirit eye ability, but the situation was too urgent for it to carefully inspect the giant azure hand, and it fell prey to the surprise attack as a result. After the divine essence-effused mountain had been refined for a second time, it was so extraordinarily heavy that even Han Li wouldn't dare to take a direct attack from it. As such, despite the fact that the giant ape possessed strength that was even slightly superior to Han Li's, it was still naturally unable to withstand the impact from divine essence-effused mountain and sent flying like a giant cannonball. Han Li had clearly already anticipated this sequence of events, and he immediately pointed a finger toward the distance. The pillar of golden lightning that was being kept at bay by the giant purple sword immediately changed directions at his behest, striking the giant ape's body in a flash. Golden arcs of lightning flashed erratically amid a loud thunderclap, and a net of golden lightning enshrouded the devilish ape's entire body before exploding into balls of golden light. Immediately thereafter, golden lightning completely inundated the giant ape's body, and all of this had taken place in just the span of a few breaths. At this moment, the azure arrows in the sword formation all disappeared into the golden light as countless streaks of azure light, thereby further fueling the attack. However, from the devilish ape's perspective, the worst was still yet to come. Among the azure arrows that were hurtling through the air, several tens of them suddenly transformed into hair-thin azure threads that were many times faster than the rest of the arrows. These azure threads pierced through the golden light, then disappeared into the light barrier on the other side in a flash. The devilish ape had remained silent prior to this, but it suddenly let loose a roar of shock and fury. It appeared that the mundane-looking azure threads had truly wounded the beast. Han Li was ecstatic to hear this, and he immediately laid a hand onto the top of his own head, upon which the golden projection up above elongated before also disappearing into the azure light barrier. At the same time, the two shadow puppets standing behind Han Li disappeared into his shadow without any premonition. In the next instant, spatial fluctuations erupted in the air high above the sword formation, following which 6 balls of golden light emerged. The balls of light then transformed into 6 massive shimmering golden fists that crashed down from above with devastating force. Meanwhile, a pair of golden figures flashed from the ground below, and 2 golden longswords appeared alongside a golden saber. The 3 weapons slashed through the air, sending countless blade projections hurtling forth in a frenzy. Just as the second wave of attacks was also going to disappear into the ball of light, a sharp cry suddenly rang out, and the ball of light was shattered from the inside. Immediately thereafter, crimson light flashed, and a streak of crimson light shot forth from within. The streak of light flew around within the sword formation in an erratic manner before stopping in midair, revealing itself to be a glowing projection. This was none other than the devilish ape's soul, which had almost inflicted a grievous wound on Han Li earlier. The crimson projection was wielding the blade segment, which had not only reverted back to its original form, but had also become as red as blood, creating a rather harrowing sight to behold. Loud cracks suddenly rang out above and below, and the 6 golden fists, as well as the golden saber and swords, all shattered in unison. The azure arrows that were constantly appearing in the surrounding area also disappeared, and it seemed that no further arrows could be manifested. Slightly down below the location where the ball of light had exploded, the devilish ape's physical body was slowly revealed as the dust settled. Its face had turned extremely pale, and many cracked and charred sections could be seen all over its suit of purple armor. Furthermore, several tens of thumb-sized holes had been punched all over the suit of armor, and it was stained with copious amounts of blood, clearly indicating that the giant ape had been severely wounded. As such, it had been forced to unleash its devilish arts and expel its soul out of its body again. However, Han Li's expression darkened significantly upon seeing this. That last sequence of attacks had been meticulously planned out, and he had thought that it would have spelled certain doom for the devilish ape, but that was clearly not the case. The crimson projection looked on at its ruined body, and unadulterated fury burned within its eyes as it said in a frosty voice, "Well done. It took me several hundred years to recover my body to this state, but you've completely ruined it again. In fact, it's in an even worse condition than before. In that case, I no longer have any qualms. Even if I have to sacrifice this body, I'm going to kill you to assuage my wrath. Actually, no, I'll use your body as a temporary vessel for my soul." As soon as its voice fell, The devilish ape abruptly swung the blade segment in its hand through the air, sending a streak of crimson light hurtling forth with devastating might. However, what was strange was that, as opposed to aiming its attack toward the sword formation around it, the streak of crimson light was sweeping toward the giant ape's physical body. The crimson light disappeared into the giant ape's body in a flash without any impediment, following which a peculiar scene ensued. The devilish ape's physical body began to shrivel up at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye, and moments later, the crimson light rose up into the air again. At this point, the body within the suit of purple armor had been completely reduced to a dry, dark purple corpse, and the streak of crimson light transformed into the blade segment once again. However, there was an overpowering odor of blood and gore emanating from the blade segment, and clouds of inky black devilish chi were also surging forth from it. Furthermore, black and red runes were erupting from the blade in a frenzy, and the devilish ape suddenly tossed the blade segment into the air, then began to chant something while making a hand seal. A string of unintelligible incantations rang out, and Han Li had no idea what the devilish ape was about to do next, but he knew that it had seriously been infuriated. It had even sucked away all of the residual blood essence within its own body, so it had to be preparing some kind of extremely powerful attack. With that in mind, Han Li certainly wasn't going to just stand by idly and allow the devilish ape to have its way. He immediately made a hand seal to spur his sword formation into action, and the azure light barrier shuddered as hundreds of head-sized lotus flowers appeared upon it. The lotus flowers rotated on the spot, while blasting forth pillars of azure light that hurtled directly toward the devilish ape. However, the events that unfolded next made Han Li's expression darken even further. In the face of the oncoming pillars of light, the devilish ape didn't even bother to look at them before flicking a nonchalant finger toward the blade segment. A dull thump rang out, and the space around the blade segment warped as a burst of invisible fluctuations proliferated outward. After coming into contact with these fluctuations, the azure pillars of light were all completely vanquished and disappeared on the spot. Several hundred pillars of azure light had been unleashed at once, yet not even a single one of them was able to even get close to the devilish ape. Han Li was quite astonished to see this, and he was really beginning to grow concerned now. Before he had a chance to figure out what kind of ability the devilish ape had just unleashed, it let loose a cold harumph, and crimson light swirled around its body, following which a purple projection emerged soundlessly above its head. This projection was of a giant purple ape that bore a strong resemblance to the devilish ape, except it didn't have any horns on its head. Furthermore, the projection's demonic eyes were flashing with five-colored light, and there was a silver pattern that was several feet in size inscribed on its chest. Upon closer inspection, one would discover that the silver patterns constructed the character for the word mountain. That's a giant mountain ape. This was the first time that Han Li had seen this legendary true spirit being, but he was able to immediately identify it. After all, only this true spirit being had such strange patterns on its chest. This devilish had to possess the bloodline of the giant mountain ape. Otherwise, it would definitely be unable to manifest this projection. Han Li appraised the purple projection in the sword formation, and a hint of yearning flashed through his eyes. Letter 1D65B, letter 1D493, letter 1D486, letter 1D65A, letter 1D498, letter 1D486, letter 1D484, letter 1D490, letter 1D4F6. The giant mountain ape was one of the true spirit beings in the 12 awakening transformations, so if he could secure the true spirit blood of this ape, then not only would he attain another transformation, the powers of all of his other transformations would also be enhanced significantly. With that in mind, Han Li was even more intent on killing this holy-grade devilish beast. However, normal attacks were completely ineffective against it. As such, following a brief hesitation, Han Li took a deep breath before rustling a sleeve to produce a mundane-looking bracelet. This was the Spirit Beast bracelet that contained his gold-devouring beetles. In order to kill this devilish ape, he was planning to unleash this trump card of his. Releasing too many gold-devouring beetles at once would severely exhaust his spiritual sense, but if he could end this battle in a short time, then the aftereffects would still be bearable. With Han Li's current spiritual sense, he could control 100 gold-devouring beetles for around 15 minutes. However, if the number of spirit beetles released were to be doubled, the amount of time he'd be able to control them would be cut down by 3/4. If it weren't for the fact that the Spring Dawn sword formation had been set up, perhaps Han Li wouldn't dare to use this trump card. However, seeing as the devilish ape had been trapped in the sword formation, thereby significantly limiting the area it could move around in. This was the perfect battlefield for the gold-devouring beetles to shine. According to Han Li's estimations, with the powers of his current mature gold-devouring beetles, it should only take around 5 minutes for 100 of them to take care of his opponent. His only concern was that if he were to expend too much of his spiritual sense, most of his abilities would also be severely debilitated. In that case, it would be quite dangerous for him if he were to encounter any powerful foes on his way back. However, those thoughts only flashed through his mind for an instant before he refocused on the battle at hand. To him, the top priority was naturally to take care of the enemy before him first. Everything else could wait until after this battle. However, before Han Li could inject his spiritual sense into the spirit beast bracelet he just summoned, the devilish ape within the sword formation suddenly ceased its chanting and let loose a low roar as it expelled a ball of crimson light out of its mouth. The ball of light disappeared into the crimson blade segment in a flash, following which the blade rotated on the spot, while the inky black devilish chi it had previously emitted began to tumble and surge violently. A loud ringing sound erupted, following which specks of black light suddenly appeared around the blade segment, then spread to all parts of the sword formation. Han Li faltered slightly as he sensed that there was something amiss with the world's origin chi in this nearby area, and he hurriedly cast his gaze around him. The sight that he was greeted by immediately made his heart jolt with shock. All of the devilish chi within the passageway had begun to churn violently, and swaths of black light were erupting from within, surging directly toward the sword formation. The Spring Dawn sword formation seemed to have transformed into a massive vortex that was drawing in black chi in an insatiable manner. However, after reaching the sword formation, these waves of devilish chi were kept at bay by the azure light barrier. There, they formed a series of black balls of light, of which there was an innumerable amount, but none of them could actually enter the sword formation. True devilish chi. Han Li identified the nature of these black balls of light in an instant, and his eyelids twitched violently upon making this discovery. Right at this moment, an earth-shattering boom erupted within the sword formation, causing the entire passageway to quake violently, as if it were on the verge of collapse. Immediately thereafter, a burst of terrifying spiritual pressure rose up into the heavens from the center of the sword formation, causing even the azure light barrier to wobble unsteadily. Han Li was quite startled by this development, and he immediately turned his attention back to the center of the sword formation. A peculiar scene then unfolded right before Han Li's eyes. The entire sword formation was filled by countless runes of different sizes. Each and every one of these runes was flashing with faint black light, and they were expanding and shrinking erratically while also fluctuating in brightness. At the center of these runes, the crimson blade segment was hovering in a motionless manner. At this point, it was no longer accurate to call it a blade segment, as the missing top half had also appeared somehow. Furthermore, there were 3 unidentifiable ancient golden characters that had appeared on the crimson blade, and the 3 characters were all shimmering with golden light. Han Li narrowed eyes and discovered, much to his surprise, that all of the black runes were flashing in perfect synchronicity with the crimson blade, as if the blade were controlling all of these runes. A burst of cackling rang out, and the devilish ape suddenly made a hand seal. The purple ape projection above its head then extended a massive hand and drew the crimson blade into its grasp. Immediately thereafter, an incredible turn of events unfolded. The golden characters on the surface of the blade seemed to have come alive as they swirled while radiating scintillating light, following which a crisp ringing sound rang out. Han Li could sense that the world's origin chi within the sword formation had been plunged into complete chaos, following which all of the black runes surged toward the blade in a frenzy like moths to a flame. At the same time, the blade began to release a series of black halos, and all of the runes disappeared without a trace after coming into contact with these halos. Meanwhile, the color of the blade darkened slightly, and after all of the runes had been absorbed, the halos also disappeared, while the crisp ringing sound cut off in an abrupt manner. At this point, the crimson blade had turned an inky black color, and the giant ape projection swung it gently through the air, upon which the 3 ancient characters on the blade instantly began to radiate shimmering golden light, creating quite a mystical sight to behold. However, Han Li's pupils contracted drastically upon seeing this as he suddenly gripped onto his arm with his other hand. At the same time, He was staring intently at the black blade in the ape projection's hand, and his face had turned deathly pale. That's a profound heavenly treasure, but that's impossible. If you possess such a powerful treasure that defies the natural order, how did you sustain such severe injuries? Han Li exclaimed in a voice that was trembling slightly. How do you know this is a profound heavenly treasure? The devilish ape's expression changed drastically upon hearing Han Li's words, and a vicious purple light flashed through its eyes. However, Han Li didn't have any intention of answering the giant ape's question, as his arm had been afflicted by a burst of searing pain, and the agonizing sensation was coming from none other than the location where the profound heavenly sword had been sealed. He had been struck by this pain without any premonition after the giant ape projection had swung the black blade through the air a few times, and he could sense that the profound heavenly sword was fighting to emerge from his arm, as if it had been provoked by the black blade. Only then did a thought suddenly occur to Han Li, thereby allowing him to guess what the black blade was. Seeing as the devilish ape wasn't refuting his claim, Han Li's heart sank even further. Not only was he using most of his magic power to restrict the profound heavenly sword in his arm with all his might, even if he were to use his gold-devouring beetles, he wasn't confident at all that they'd be effective in the face of another profound heavenly treasure. His other alternative was to use the profound heavenly sword in his arm, but the memories of what had happened the last time he'd used the treasure was still clear in his mind, and he definitely didn't want to suffer the same fate again. After all, this was a perilous realm that was rife with devilish beasts. Allowing himself to be completely debilitated here was no different from committing suicide. However, the memory of the astonishing might of his profound heavenly sword was also something that remained clear in his mind. The blade that the giant ape projection was clearly an incomplete profound heavenly treasure, but if it possessed even half of the power of the profound heavenly sword that was sealed in his arm, then he definitely wouldn't be able to survive an attack from it. The spring-dawn sword formation was indeed quite powerful, but how was it supposed to oppose the power of laws? Seeing as Han Li was displaying no intention of answering its question, the devilish ape within the sword formation was infuriated even further. The giant mountain ape projection above its head immediately aimed its black blade toward Han Li at its behest. Han Li's eyelids twitched, and his entire body instantly became drenched in cold sweat. With the profound heavenly treasure's ability to slice through space, even trying to escape would be completely futile. As such, he would either have to give up and allow himself to be killed, or use his own profound heavenly sword to oppose the ape projection. Both of those courses of action were far from ideal. However, at this moment, the giant ape projection had already raised the black blade above its head, so he didn't have time to think of any other feasible plans. Wait, the devilish ape has already lost its physical body, and its cultivation base has also been severely damaged from its injuries, so how does it still have enough power to use a profound heavenly treasure? Could it be that it's not actually powering the treasure itself, but instead drawing on another power source? In this desperate situation, a thought suddenly occurred to Han Li, and he felt like he was onto something. At this moment, a vicious look appeared on the devilish ape's face, and the black blade that was being wielded by the purple projection slowly began its descent. Han Li was greatly alarmed to see this, and he immediately gritted his teeth as he wrenched his hand away from his arm. A dull tearing sound rang out, following which a yellow wooden rod appeared in his hand. It was none other than the profound heavenly fruit. Han Li wasted no time at all as he flicked his wrist and tossed the profound heavenly fruit up into the air. Golden light flashed, and his provenance true devil projection reappeared. One of the golden arms of the projection caught the profound heavenly fruit in its grasp, while the other arms all made hand seals, and brilliant golden light began to erupt from the projection's body. Immediately thereafter, all of the golden light surged toward the profound heavenly fruit like flowing water, making the fruit glow with dazzling light, while the dark green patterns on its surface also became more exuberant in color. Han Li was ecstatic to see this. Right at this moment, a dull thump rang out, and a burst of black ripples erupted from the black blade. The ripples appeared to be completely mundane and nondescript initially, but after surging through the air for over 100 feet, it suddenly swept up a black wave of chi that was several tens of feet tall, which hurtled directly toward Han Li. The black wave struck the azure light barrier in a flash, and the latter instantly began to tremor as countless azure lotus flowers appeared on its surface again. However, in the next instant, an incredible scene ensued. The black wave swept through the azure lotus flowers and completely eradicated them with ease, then passed through the azure light barrier as if it didn't even exist. Han Li's eyelids twitched upon seeing this, and he immediately made a hand seal. All of a sudden, countless specks of five-colored light appeared in the surrounding area, all of which rushed toward the profound heavenly fruit like moths to a flame. Green light flashed from one end of the profound heavenly fruit, and a shimmering blade that was around a foot in length suddenly emerged from it. The blade was of a vibrant green color and as smooth as a mirror. However, there was a line of 5 green runes inscribed onto the center of the blade, all of which were emanating a menacing light. In the face of the oncoming black wave, golden light flashed from the Provenance True Devil projection above Han Li's head, and it brought the green longsword down in an instant. Han Li immediately felt a vast amount of magic power flood out of his body at once. At the same time, golden light swirled around the projection's body, and this golden light also surged into the green blade in a frenzy. As a result, not only did the Provenance True Devil projection shrink down almost by half, its body also became very blurry and indistinct. The world's origin chi nearby suddenly churned violently, and countless 5-colored runes appeared out of thin air. At the same time, howling winds and loud thunderclaps erupted, and all of the black light that was surging toward Han Li seemed to have encountered some kind of immense resistant force, faltering initially before dispersing to all sides. After the profound heavenly sword had been brought down, it was as if all of the world's origin chi in the nearby area had been absorbed by it before being used to unleash a devastating strike. A green sword projection was materialized in a flash, and it was as bright and dazzling as heavenly lightning, immediately illuminating the entire passageway with its exceptional radiance. The inky black devil was unable to mask its scintillating light in the slightest, and the almighty black wave was also stopped cold in its tracks by this sword projection. In the next instant, the entire space was severed into 2 completely different worlds by some kind of invisible power. The upper half was shimmering with azure light with 5-colored runes surging through it, while the lower half was filled with churning black ripples that were filled with specks of black light. A sharp ringing sound rang out from the border between these 2 worlds, following which 2 bursts of invisible fluctuations erupted forth, sweeping through the entire space like a powerful hurricane. Aside from the locations where Han Li and the devilish ape were situated, the law fluctuations swept up everything in the surrounding area before destroying them into nothingness. Even the Spring Dawn Sword formation was completely destroyed after just a few flashes in the face of this clash between the 2 powers of laws. It was forced to revert back to 72 azure flying swords, which were also pulverized into specks of azure light in a flash. It was quite clear that the power of laws imbued within the green sword projection was far superior to that of the black wave, and the latter only managed to put up some token resistance before it was completely overwhelmed. The power of laws contained within the black wave was vanquished by a more powerful force. The giant mountain ape projection above the devilish ape's head had also shrunk down significantly after unleashing that attack, and it was completely eradicated by the invisible law fluctuations that swept through the area. In the face of the power of laws imbued within the green sword projection, the black blade was also shattered. "That's a complete profound heavenly treasure, but that's impossible," the devilish ape exclaimed as crimson light tremored erratically around its entire body, and it looked as if it were witnessing the most incredible thing in the world. However, it didn't have any time to appreciate the scenery as the green light surging toward it was about to completely destroy it soon. As such, spiritual light flashed from its body, and it flew toward the hall that it had been residing in as a streak of crimson light. However, the streak of light only managed to fly through the air for several hundred feet before the green sword projection flashed, and the devilish ape's soul was enshrouded under a green wave of the power of heaven and earth. A peculiar scene then unfolded. The streak of crimson light faltered within the green light, and the devilish ape's crimson body was revealed again. Furthermore, it had been completely immobilized, just like the space that had congealed around it. The power of heaven and earth descended upon the passageway, and a string of cracking sounds rang out incessantly in a radius of roughly 100 feet around the devilish ape's body. A series of white spatial rifts then appeared in the nearby area, giving the surrounding space the appearance of a cracked mirror. The devilish ape's soul only had a chance to let loose a blood-curdling cry before it was shattered like a wooden puppet. Thus concluded the life of this holy gray devilish ape. A massive black hole had appeared in the wake of the shattered space, and the fragments of the devilish ape's soul were all sucked soundlessly into the black hole, along with the white spatial fragments nearby. The black hole then also disappeared amid a flash of black light, and only the blade segment remained hovering in midair, having reverted back to its original purple form. Hanli heaved a long sigh of relief upon seeing this, and he quickly made a hand seal before pointing a finger at the golden projection up above. The Provenance True Devil projection gently shook the profound heavenly sword in its hand, and the green blade of the sword instantly disintegrated into specks of five-colored light. Thus, the profound heavenly fruit reverted back to its original form before slowly descending from above. Hanli waved a sleeve through the air, sending forth a burst of azure light to try and stow the treasure away. However, green light suddenly flashed from the profound heavenly fruit, and it transformed into a ball of green light that almost instantly disappeared into Hanli's arm. A burst of searing pain speared through Hanli's arm, and he hurriedly rolled up his sleeves to inspect the arm in question. There he discovered a yellow mark that was identical in appearance to the profound heavenly fruit on a section of his arm. The mark was quickly fading at a rate that was discernible to the naked eye, and finally disappeared into an extremely faint scar in the end. Hanli's lips twitched as a wry smile appeared on his face. It appeared that the profound heavenly fruit was intent on settling in his arm, and had sealed itself in there again. Following the disappearance of the profound heavenly fruit, all of the phenomena taking place in the passageway also disintegrated into nothingness, and the power of laws in the nearby area also instantly vanished. The entire passageway was filled with devilish chi again, just as it had been in the beginning. Hanli cast his gaze into the distance, and blue light flashed through his eyes as he made a grabbing motion with one of his hands. Immediately thereafter, specks of azure light appeared within the devilish chi in the distance before converting to form several tens of fist-sized balls of azure light. These balls of light then transformed into 72 small azure swords that were each around a foot in length. They were none other than the azure bamboo cloudswarm swords that had just been destroyed as collateral damage by the power of laws that had wreaked havoc in the area. However, the flying swords, void form ability ensured that they hadn't sustained much damage at all during that ordeal. All of the flying swords whistled back toward Hanli as streaks of azure light at his behest, then reverted back to their sword forms after reaching him. Hanli carefully swept his spiritual sense over the flying swords to inspect them for damage, and he heaved a sigh of relief after ascertaining that no substantial damage had occurred. He made a hand seal, and all of the flying swords disappeared up his sleeve. After that, Hanli cast his gaze toward the distance, and a hint of scorching yearning appeared in his eyes as he pointed his finger up ahead several times. Two shadowy objects, one large and one small, immediately flew toward him, and the devilish chi parted to grant them passage. One of them was the physical body of the devilish ape, which was still encapsulated in that suit of purple armor, while the other was a blade segment that was around half a foot in length. Hanli cast his gaze toward the devilish ape first, and he discovered that it had been completely reduced to a dried corpse. Furthermore, the suit of purple armor that it was wearing has also lost a lot of its luster, indicating that a lot of its power had seeped away following the devilish ape's passing. His brows furrowed slightly as he suddenly reached out and pressed his 5 fingers onto the chest piece of the suit of armor. Gray light flashed from his fingertips, and the purple armor suddenly let loose an anguished wail before separating into several parts amid a flash of gray light. The pieces of armor then detached themselves from the dried corpse, then attempted to flee the scene as several streaks of purple light. It appeared that it had still retained some of its spiritual nature. Hanli had already witnessed the astonishing might of this suit of armor, so he had naturally made preparations in advance. As such, as soon as the streaks of purple light attempted to fly away, he let loose a cold harumph before sweeping a sleeve through the air to send forth a plume of azure threads. Azure light flashed, and the streaks of purple light were all tangled up within the azure threads. Immediately thereafter, a clear ringing sound erupted from Hanli's sleeve, and the heaven-void cauldron flew out from within. The lid of the cauldron flew off of its own accord, and the azure threads forcibly dragged the streaks of purple into the cauldron. After the lid sealed the opening of the cauldron again, the treasure hovered in a stationary manner before Hanli. Hanli swept a nonchalant sleeve toward the small cauldron, and it abruptly disappeared on the spot. Only then did Hanli turn his attention to the dried corpse that had been completely exposed. The dried corpse still retained all of its fur, but its skin had turned a dark purple color, as if it were an ancient corpse that had been abandoned for countless years. A cold light flashed through Han Li's eyes, and he suddenly opened his mouth to blast forth a streak of azure sword chi that struck the dried corpse to try and slice it in half. However, much to his surprise, a metallic clang rang out as the sword chi struck the shriveled corpse, and the latter was left completely unscathed while the streak of sword chi was repelled. Han Li faltered slightly upon seeing this before slowly extending a hand out of his sleeve. Spiritual light flashed from his palm, and a small azure sword slowly emerged. The small sword was then elongated to around a foot in length, and it was shimmering with bright azure light. Han Li flicked his wrist, and the azure longsword shot forth as a streak of azure light before striking the dantian of the ape's corpse. On this occasion, a dull thump rang out as if the sword had struck a dense log. Its tip buried itself into the dried corpse, but it was repelled once again after making an incision that was only around an inch deep. Han Li's expression changed drastically upon seeing this. This holy-grade devilish ape's body was so resolute that it was comparable to his own body. If it weren't for the fact that he'd managed to trap the devilish ape in his sword formation, the combination of this purple suit of armor and its immensely powerful body would have been very difficult to handle. As expected of a fearsome mid-body integration stage being, the early body integration stage, Zhao Kai being that he'd faced in the past, couldn't even hold a candle to this devilish ape. If neither of them used their profound heavenly treasures, and the ape was at the height of its powers, he'd have no choice but to flee for his life. Letter 1D6A letter 1D5FF, letter 1D5F2, letter 1D4, letter 1D6A0, letter 1D556, letter 1D6AC, letter 1D5FC, letter 1D5FA. With that in mind, Han Li took a deep breath, but he certainly wasn't about to give up. Shimmering golden light radiated from his arm as his magic power surged forth in a frenzy, injecting itself into the azure longsword in his hand. A clear cry akin to a dragon's roar instantly erupted from the longsword, following which a cold azure light flashed from it, and it began to stab into the dried corpse inch by inch. After several inches of the blade had burrowed itself into the ape's dantian, Han Li suddenly flicked his wrist, and the tip of the sword created a circular incision that was comparable to the size of a large bowl. Immediately thereafter, the azure longsword disappeared in a flash, and Han Li extended a hand into the dantian of the corpse to pull something out from within. This was an egg-sized inky black bead that was emanating extremely pure true devilish chi, and it was none other than Han Li's target for this trip, the devilish core of a holy-grade devilish beast. With this item, he'd be able to repair the suit of heavenly devilish armor. He couldn't accurately estimate the power of the suit of devilish armor after being repaired, but it shouldn't be inferior to the suit of purple armor he'd just captured. Unfortunately, the suit of purple armor had clearly been completely refined by the devilish ape, and even if he were to refine it again, its powers would most likely be severely debilitated, so it wasn't very useful to him. Han Li contemplated this issue in a rather forlorn manner as he turned a hand over to produce a black jade box. He removed the lid of the box before pointing a finger at the devilish core, and a burst of black light instantly surged forth from within the box to draw the devilish core into it. After that, Han Li placed the lid back on the box, then summoned 2 golden and silver talismans, both of which he plastered onto the box. Brilliant golden and silver light erupted, and the wisps of devilish chi emanating from within the jade box were completely cut off, thereby completely sealing the devilish core within. Han Li stowed away the jade box in an unhurried manner before inspecting the purple blade segment. Han Li stared at the treasure, and a rather peculiar look appeared on his face that was a mixture of excitement and befuddlement. Is this actually a profound heavenly treasure? Its power is far inferior to my profound heavenly sword. Could it be that it's because this is a damaged treasure? Han Li murmured to himself as he narrowed his eyes. Instead of approaching the blade segment, Han Li closed his eyes, and his spiritual sense circulated throughout his body as he carefully inspected his internal condition. In the end, he made a hand seal, and brilliant golden light flashed from his body as he summoned his golden projection again, before also sweeping his spiritual sense toward it. As evidenced by the dark expression that appeared on his face, the situation wasn't a very positive one. Not only had he expended close to half of the magic power within his body, his provenance true devil projection had also shrunk down considerably, and it would most likely take several decades of arduous cultivation to return it to its former glory. These were heavy losses for just a single battle. The only silver lining here was that he hadn't had to expend any blood essence on this occasion, so no direct damage had been inflicted on his body. However, this was also due to the fact that the attack he'd unleashed with the profound heavenly sword on this occasion wasn't even 10% as powerful as that of the previous occasion. This was partially due to the fact that he hadn't directly used his physical body to power the profound heavenly treasure, using the power of his projection to serve that purpose instead. The other reason for this was that the profound heavenly sword had been forced out of his body by the power of laws emanating from the blade segment. As such, the power unleashed by the profound heavenly sword was naturally severely hampered, but he still managed to kill the devilish ape without completely crippling himself. The purple blade segment before his eyes could perhaps also control some kind of power of laws, but it was clearly incomparable to his profound heavenly sword. Thus, Han Li was rather skeptical about whether this was actually a real profound heavenly treasure. However, the fact of the matter was that a slash unleashed by this blade segment had been able to destroy his spring-dawn sword formation with ease. So, if this weren't a profound heavenly treasure, it was definitely not something that normal divine spirit treasures could compare with. As such, Han Li was leaning more toward the notion that this treasure was incomplete, thereby severely hampering its power and allowing it to be used by the devilish ape. Of course, this could also be due to the fact that the power of laws imbued with this blade segment was of the lowest caliber among all profound spirit treasures. Alternatively, the power of laws imbued within his profound heavenly sword could have just so happened to be the bane of the power of laws contained within this blade segment, which would explain why the clash between the two powers of laws proved to be such a mismatch in the end. These thoughts raced rapidly through Han Li's mind, and he analyzed all of the potential factors involved within mere moments. The more he pondered these notions, the more he began to value the purple blade segment. The profound heavenly sword sealed within his arm was too powerful for him to control at present, but this incomplete and severely debilitated profound heavenly treasure should be a different story. Otherwise, how had the devilish ape been able to use the treasure even after losing its physical body and having its cultivation base drop down to around Han Li's level? With that in mind, Han Li took a deep breath to repress the excitement in his heart before raising a hand. He then flicked his 5 fingers through the air, and 5 bursts of gray light surged forth from his fingertips, sweeping directly toward the purple blade segment. However, a swath of purple light suddenly erupted from the blade segment, and the gray light sweeping toward it was repelled as a result. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly upon seeing this before reaching out with his other hand to send a wave of 5-colored glacial flames surging through the air. However, following a string of loud rumbling explosions, the 5-colored glacial flames were also kept at bay by the blade segment. A hint of surprise finally appeared on Han Li's face, and after stroking his chin in deep thought for a moment, a thought suddenly seemed to have occurred to him. He abruptly raised a hand, which instantly took on a shimmering golden hue, and a burst of golden light erupted from his palm, sweeping directly toward the blade segment. On this occasion, the purple blade segment offered no resistance, allowing the golden light approach it before drawing it closer to Han Li. A hint of elation appeared on his face as he carefully appraised this treasure. At such close quarters, he discovered that the treasure was close to completely transparent, and that it was slowly absorbing the golden light around it. As it did so, the slightly feeble strange creature within the blade suddenly became more energetic as it moved around within the blade. Wisps of golden light were also gradually emanating from the blade segment, looking as if it were being assimilated by Han Li's provenance true devil arts. Han Li was initially given quite a fright upon seeing this before being overjoyed by this development. This incomplete profound heavenly treasure was far too easy to control. He could sense that he'd immediately be able to control the treasure after injecting some more of the devilish chi from his provenance true devil arts into it. He was almost certain now that this blade segment was a profound heavenly treasure from the elder devil realm. Otherwise, it definitely wouldn't have been so sensitive toward devilish chi. After a brief hesitation, brilliant golden light began to radiate from Han Li's body, and golden scales also began to surface along his skin. He had activated his provenance true devil arts to its maximal extent, and bursts of golden light were flowing toward the blade segment in a frenzy. The blade segment devoured the golden light with relish, and after just the span of a few breaths, it had taken on a golden hue as opposed to its original purple color. However, the blade segment wasn't devouring the golden light any slower as a result. Instead, The unknown creature within it suddenly became very elated, and its body also took on a golden color. In contrast, Han Li was beginning to struggle a little. A third of what remained of his magic power had been absorbed by this blade segment in mere moments, and he immediately put an end to this process as the golden light around his body faded. After that, the golden blade segment in his hand disappeared up his sleeve. He hadn't completely assimilated this treasure yet, but he could just barely use it, and that was enough for now. He wasn't going to stand around like an idiot, wasting all his magic power to feed a treasure when he was situated in such a perilous place. With that in mind, Han Li quickly pulled out several small vials of different colors from his storage bracelet, then tipped out a few pills from each vial before swallowing them all at once. These pills were naturally all fast-acting magic power replenishment pills, and even though they couldn't immediately help him recover to his peak condition, they were certainly better than nothing. After that, green light flashed from one of Han Li's hands, and a top-grade spirit stone appeared. Green light then flashed as he began to absorb the pure spiritual power within the spirit stone. This place was fraught with peril, so he certainly wasn't going to be stingy with his spirit stones here. While absorbing spiritual power from the spirit stone, Han Li cast his gaze toward the devilish ape's dried corpse, and his expression changed slightly as if a thought had suddenly occurred to him. Letter 1D65B, letter 1D493, letter 1D4E, letter 1D65A, letter 1D500, letter 1D486, letter 1D658, letter 1D490, letter 1D4AT. He carefully inspected the corpse a few times, but didn't discover any storage bracelets or anything of that nature. His brows furrowed slightly as he raised his other hand, and an inky black ring shot forth. The ring revolved around the dried corpse before emitting a vast expanse of white light, and the corpse was drawn into the ring before the latter flew back to Han Li. After that, Han Li's body swayed, and he flew into the empty hall again as a streak of azure light. Aside from the ruined formation on the ground below, the hall was almost completely empty. The reason why it was only almost completely empty was because the crimson jade bed was still lying motionlessly in a corner, flashing with faint crimson light. Han Li swept his spiritual sense throughout the area to ascertain that there were no other suspicious items in the area, then immediately waved his hand toward the crimson bed. The hefty-looking jade bed rose up into the air and flew toward Han Li, who thrust a palm toward it, and the bed hovered a certain distance away from him at his behest. Han Li inspected the bed carefully to find that nothing special could be gleaned from its surface. He then swept his spiritual sense toward it, only for it to be repelled by the bed. As opposed to being disheartened by this, Han Li was quite elated as blue light flashed through his eyes. The sight that he was greeted by after unleashing his spirit eye ability immediately made him utter a faint cry of surprise. A slightly grim expression appeared on his face as he raised an arm again to cast an incantation seal toward the crimson bed, following which an unexpected turn of events unfolded. All of a sudden, bright crimson light erupted from the bed, and a series of fist-sized silver ancient characters emerged from it. These characters revolved around in the air before forming a mysterious scripture before Han Li. Beveled silver text. Han Li immediately identified what these silver characters were, and his eyes immediately lit up. How had this text appeared on the crimson bed? How had this bed ended up in the possession of the holy grade devilish ape? Han Li's mind was filled with questions, but he ignored them for now as he quickly read through the scripture before him, upon which a peculiar look appeared on his face. Profound heavenly tool refinement technique. Han Li finally murmured hesitantly to himself after a long while, as if he didn't dare to believe what he was seeing. Even though Han Li didn't read through the scripture in detail, he could still roughly deduce that the scripture of beveled silver text was detailing a mysterious tool refinement technique that he'd never seen before. Just a quick glance through its content struck him with a sense of absurdity. This was because the materials and refinement methods stipulated in the scripture were all things that Han Li had never even thought about before. At the conclusion of the scripture, it even proclaimed that using this secret technique to refine treasures could create products that were comparable to profound heavenly treasures, which was why this was known as the profound heavenly tool refinement technique. Miraculous feats like refining the sun and evaporating oceans were only the simplest two refinement methods stipulated in this scripture, and these methods were most likely only feasible to true immortals of the true immortal realm. As such, they were nothing more than a pipe dream to Han Li. Even before reading the scripture in any greater detail, Han Li was left feeling quite disappointed. If it weren't for the fact that this scripture had been written in beveled silver text, Han Li would have most likely thought that the devilish ape had fabricated it on a whim. After pausing momentarily to ponder scripture, blue light flashed through Han Li's eyes as he cast his gaze toward the crimson bed again. Moments later, his expression changed slightly, and he really did make another discovery. All of a sudden, his body blurred, and he abruptly appeared in the air above the bed. He then spread his fingers and patted the crimson bed with a single hand. Loud rumbling booms rang out as countless thin arcs of golden lightning erupted from his fingers, forming a massive golden net that encompassed the entire bed within. The silver runes all withdrew, as if they'd encountered the bane of their existence, and they instantly disappeared without a trace. In the face of the violent attacks from the golden arcs of lightning, the crimson bed was completely pulverized, and a putrid gag-inducing burst of blood chi instantly wafted through the air. Han Li raised an eyebrow as he brought his fingers together, and the net of lightning was immediately withdrawn. Golden lightning flashed, and the blood chi down below was completely eradicated. Immediately thereafter, a palm-sized white jade badge was revealed, and there were silver runes flashing erratically upon it. Letter 1D453, letter 1D633, letter 1D452, letter 1D452, letter 1D4cc, letter 1D626, letter 1D624, letter 1D45c, letter 1D45a. Han Li wasn't all that surprised to see this, but his brows furrowed as he mused to himself. It really is another one of the outer pages. Looks like this thing is definitely authentic, but pages of the Golden Jade tome should only be found in the human and demon territories. How had it fallen into the Elder Devil realm and into the hands of this devilish ape? This was the third page of the Golden Jade tome that Han Li had obtained, but unfortunately, its contents were completely useless to him as he currently was. Perhaps he'd be able to make use of it after progressing to the Grand Ascension stage. Even so, he could certainly conduct further research into this profound heavenly tool refinement technique. If he could glean some unique insights from it, that would still be immensely beneficial to him. With that in mind, Han Li knew that it wasn't the right time to be researching this jade page, so he swept a sleeve through the air, and a burst of azure light swept forth to draw the page up his sleeve. However, the object flew away in the opposite direction as if it possessed sentient will. Fortunately, Han Li was already prepared for this, and his hand shot forth like lightning as he made a grabbing motion. A burst of invisible power immediately sealed the space in a radius of over 100 feet, and the jade badge was forcibly drawn into his hand. Han Li then immediately pulled out a jade box from his storage ring before carefully storing the jade badge into it, following which he plastered several restriction talismans onto the box. After stowing the jade box away, there was nothing else in this hall that caught Han Li's interest, so he immediately flew out into the devilish chi passageway as a streak of azure light. During his flight, he summoned another top-grade wood attribute spirit stone, holding one in each hand as he absorbed spiritual power form both of them at once. At the same time, the pills that he'd taken earlier were also beginning to take effect, and wisps of pure spiritual chi surged throughout his body before being slowly absorbed by his meridians. He was currently flying toward the location where he could sense his gold, devouring beetle. That was where Xianxia's true objective lied. He didn't know what she was plotting, but it had to be something quite big for her to be willing to take such a big risk. Now that Han Li had completed his objective for this trip, he no longer had any qualms, and he was naturally very interested in taking a look at what Xianxia was up to. His battle with the devilish ape had been an extremely perilous one, but it hadn't actually taken all that long. Meanwhile, the gold-devouring beetle that he'd sent to track Xiao had stopped at a certain location, so it was quite clear that Xianxia still wasn't finished with what she was doing, thereby making this the perfect time to go and pay her a surprise visit. He had expended a lot of his magic power, and his projection had also shrunk down by almost half of its original size, but Xianxia's lowly cultivation base was quite reassuring to him. Otherwise, if he were facing a being of a similar power level in his current state, he most likely would have snuck away rather potentially shoot himself in the foot. Han Li was flying through the passageway extremely quickly, yet halfway to his destination, an earth-shattering boom suddenly rang out within the belly of the entire giant mountain, following which a sudden turn of events abruptly unfolded. The devilish chi within the entire passageway suddenly began to churn and tumble violently in an uncontrollable manner, and resounding booms rang out within the black chi mid gusts of fierce winds. countless inky black blades of wind materials before flying all throughout the entire passageway, and Han Li was quite startled by this development, but he merely rolled up a sleeve and conjured up a layer of a gray light around his body. The blades of wind seemed to be quite fierce and destructive, but they disappeared as soon as they came into contact with the barrier of divine essence-effused light around his body. Han Li's brows furrowed slightly, and he was just trying to make sense of what was happening when a strange roar suddenly erupted like a rumbling thunderclap right beside his ears. As soon as he heard this sound, all of the magic power within his body congealed and ceased to heed his command. Immediately thereafter, the gray light around his body dispersed, and he plummeted straight downward. During this process, blades of winds crashed into his body from all directions within the passageway in a torrential downpour. If he were a normal human cultivator, he would have naturally been instantly diced into mincemeat. However, his body was already no less powerful than that of body integration stage devilish beasts, so he remained completely unscathed in the face of this sustained assault. Even so, Han Li was struck by a sense of shock and fury as he hurriedly activated his great development technique, sending a cool sensation circulating throughout his meridians. Thus, the spiritual power within his body returned to normal, and he rose up into the air as a streak of azure light again. Right at this moment, the ground down below in the entire passageway that he was situated in suddenly shattered, and loud thunderclaps rang out as countless arcs of inky black lightning surged forth in a frenzy. The devilish chi and the other stone walls of the passageway were all immediately destroyed upon making contact with these arcs of lightning, and Han Li's heart jolted with shock as he abruptly stowed away the spirit stones in his hands. Immediately thereafter, he made a hand seal, and a set of golden and silver lightning robes appeared over his body, following another rumbling thunderclap. The arcs of black lightning trapped him in a giant net, but he remained completely unscathed, safe and secure in his lightning robes. After a string of countless resounding thunderclaps erupted from below the ground, the entire devilish chi passageway collapsed amid violent flashes of black lightning. Countless massive rocks came crashing down from above, and despite Han Li's powers, he was still crushed under countless huge rocks as he'd been caught completely off guard. In the end, he was buried deep into the ground, entombed in a rocky prison. Meanwhile, the entire mountain was peak collapsing at an alarming rate, as if a gargantuan invisible hand had laid itself onto the mountain, then crushed down onto it with devastating force. Bursts of black devilish chi were also squeezed out of the cracks in the mountain faces, and all of them tried to permeate in all directions with all their might. Another loud roar erupted from within the collapsed mountain peak, following a string of deafening thunderclaps rang out once again. A dozen or so bolts of inky black lightning speared out of the collapsed mountain, before elongating to over 1,000 feet in length, while swinging wildly through the air. From a distance, it was as if the mountain had suddenly grown a dozen or so thick feelers that were thrashing about violently. After that, another earth-shattering boom rang out, and countless shattered rocks erupted from within the collapsed mountain. It was as if the entire mountain peak had been cleaved flat, and a gargantuan being that was over 10,000 feet in length appeared in its place. This was a monstrous being that was entirely constructed from black light, and countless arcs of black lighting of different sizes were flashing violently all over its body. The dozen or so feelers that had emerged earlier were only the thickest of those bolts of lightning. At the very center of the black light was a massive white face that was around an acre in area. The eyes on the giant face were wide open, and a cold light was shimmering deep within its pupils. All of a sudden, a dragon's roar rang out from within the black light, and crimson light suddenly flashed from some part on the giant monster's body. A crimson worm then tore through its body before emerging from within and flying to over 1,000 feet away in a flash. There, the crimson light faded to reveal a man in a suit of silver armor that was riddled with sharp crimson spikes. At this moment, the cold and aloof expression had disappeared from his eyes, and not only had his face turned extremely pale, it was also filled with violent fury. At the same time, a dull thump rang out from the giant monster's body, following which another being that was several thousand feet in size erupted from within. A gust of fierce azure winds surged through the air to form a Kirin projection that was over 1,000 feet in size, and the massive face let loose a furious roar. The thickest bolt of black lightning protruding from its body then crashed down like a gigantic blade amid a loud thunderclap. But the massive Kirin projection merely flashed before disappearing like an invisible breeze. In the next instant, azure winds surged through the air over 1,000 feet away, and the Kirin projection re-emerged in a flash. Immediately thereafter, brilliant spiritual light radiated from its body, and it shrank down drastically to only several tens of feet in size, upon which it became a lot more substantial, as if it had attained an actual physical form. Only then could one see that a shimmering crystal had appeared on the azure Kirin's glabella. At the same time, its eyes were also filled with shock and fury. "Who are you? How are you able to control the cave spirit?" A female voice rang out from the azure Kirin's mouth. Even though the voice was filled with rage, it was still quite pleasant to the ears. It was none other than Xianxia's voice. Before this, she had entered the true spirit cave, yet before she had a chance to find what she wanted, the silver-armored man suddenly appeared. Immediately thereafter, the cave spirit that was supposed to be in a deep slumber abruptly transformed before swallowing her whole. If it weren't for the fact that she had made ample preparations beforehand and immediately taken a special pill she'd refined in advance, then allowed the azure Kirin to possess her and transform her into this massive projection, she most likely would have been devoured by the cave spirit. "I don't who or what you are. All I want to know is where is the true Kirin essence within the true spirit cave," the silver-armored man said in a cold voice. You don't know what I am. You expect me to believe that even though you came all the way here to this true spirit cave." The giant face chuckled coldly, and its voice was slightly muffled and indistinct, but was still quite harrowing to listen to. The small part of its body that had exploded instantly healed amid a flash of black light, as if the damage it had sustained earlier was completely inconsequential. Both the silver-armored man and the azure Kirin's expressions changed upon hearing this. The Kirin projection turned to the silver-armored man and drew a sharp breath. "What? So that means you're also. Indeed, aside from beings like us, no one else knows of this true spirit cave. HMPH, don't compare me to trash like you. You failed to possess even a weak little crystal being, whereas I possess this silver worm to perfection." The silver-armored man scoffed with a derisive roll of his eyes. A hint of fury flashed through the Kirin projection's eyes upon hearing this, but its voice remained calm as it countered. "Successful possession or not hinges entirely on luck. Back then, we were each 100,000ths of the Kirin's spiritual sense, so there's no difference between us. I don't think it's a bad thing that I'm coexisting along with my host. As long as this crystal woman can ascend to a higher realm, I'll also be able to recover my true Kirin body and all of my powers." "You think she can ascend? What a joke! A mere crystal being is dreaming of ascension," the silver-armored man scoffed in a derisive manner. "How is that not possible? As long as one can obtain the true Kirin essence within the true spirit cave, there's always a chance that they'll be able to ascend to the true immortal realm, even if they're just a plank of wood," the azure Kirin countered in a calm manner. The silver-armored man didn't refute the Kirin's words, but his eyes were still filled with disdain. "Giving a crystal being true spirit essence of this caliber is a massive waste. In contrast, I possess the body of a silver worm. If I were to consume the essence, I'll be sure to evolve and attain a true dragon body in the future." "Are you saying this so I can hand over the true Kirin essence to you? We were once both part of the same being, but after so many years, we've already grown apart. Besides, even if I'm willing to back down, that thing's not going to just let you have your way. Back when we were inside the true spirit cave, it fully intended to devour both of us." The Kirin's expression darkened slightly before it cast its gaze toward the massive monster down below with a cold smile on its face. The silver-armored man could tell that the azure Kirin was merely trying to provoke both himself and the massive face being down below, but he still turned to the giant monster as he said in a cold voice, "I don't care how you managed to possess the cave spirit or what intentions you may have. Hand over the true spirit essence and I'll leave right away. Otherwise, you're going to regret it. If you want to obtain the true Kirin essence, that's quite easy. All you have to do is enter my stomach and become one with me, and you'll be able to obtain it then," the giant face cackled in response. "Letter 1D4 BB letter 1D4 5F letter 2 1 2F letter 2 1 2F letter 1D4 6 4 letter 1D4 5 2 letter 1D4 4F letter 1D4 B8 letter 1D4 5C letter 1D6 2E." "What? You've already devoured it. Wait, no, only actual beings with physical bodies can absorb the true spirit essence. How were you able to accomplish this with the cave spirit's body?" The silver-armored man was unconvinced. The massive face was silent for a moment before replying in a dark voice. "Who told you that I possess the cave spirit's body? Do you two really think that you're the first beings to have come to this place?" "What do you mean by that?" The azure light around the Kirin projection's body flashed with bewilderment. I've already devoured 3 or 4 beings like you, and if I were to devour the 2 of you along with so much true spirit blood, I'll be able to attain a true spirit body soon. As for the true Kirin essence, it's naturally inside my body. That's enough chit-chat. If you want to know more, then allow yourselves to be consumed by me, and you'll know everything when you become a part of me. The giant monster seemed to be unwilling to speak any further on the matter, and black light flashed around its body as 2 arcs of black lightning shot forth amid a loud thunderclap. From a distance, it appeared as if 2 huge black spears were about to puncture the Kirin projection and the silver-armored man's bodies. After hearing the monstrous face's words, the silver-armored man's expression had darkened significantly, and his fury was even further exacerbated now that the monster was attacking him. As such, he also did away with his words as his body swayed, and he suddenly transformed into 3 identical beings. One of them raised a hand, and a silver flying sword shot forth, transforming into a streak of silver sword chi that was over 100 feet in length before vanquishing the oncoming arc of lightning in a flash. Meanwhile, the azure Kirin projection opened its cavernous mouth, and its head suddenly expanded several times in size. After that, it simply swallowed the bolt of black lightning that was hurtling toward it. The silver-armored man's eyes flashed upon seeing this, and he suddenly said, "So you've mastered the great engulfment technique already. With your powers, you're worthy of joining forces with me on this occasion. Let's kill this thing together and split the true Kirin essence evenly among ourselves. True spirit essence is not something that can be completely refined by a being like this, even if it has devoured the essence." The azure Kirin pondered this proposal for a moment before immediately agreeing. "All right, you have yourself a deal." At present, it was a combination between Xianxia and a wisp of the true spirit Kirin's spiritual sense, but it was still filled with yearning toward the true Kirin essence. Even though it was quite wary of the silver-armored man, it had no choice but to team up with him to vanquish their common enemy. Thus, azure light flashed from the Kirin projection's body, and it swelled to over 1,000 feet in size again as an astonishing aura erupted into the heavens. The silver-armored man's 3 avatars swayed in unison upon seeing this, and silver light flashed above one of them as a massive sword projection that was over 100 feet in length appeared again. Another, one of the avatars made a hand seal, and balls of crimson flames suddenly appeared out of thin air around its body. Meanwhile, the final avatar's body blurred before it transformed into a silver worm. In the face of such a strange opponent, both Xianxia and the silver-armored being were taking the situation very seriously. At this moment, the monstrous face down below suddenly cackled. "You dare to try and oppose me? Good. I won't have to chase after you if you don't run away. However, before taking care of you two, I should address the other unwelcome guests present." As soon as its voice fell, a loud thunderclap suddenly erupted from the dozen or so thickest bolts of black lighting sprouting from its body, and they abruptly sprang forth without any premonition. Before the arcs of lightning had even struck their target, an enormous burst of spiritual pressure swept downward in the form of fierce winds. A silver shadow suddenly flashed from that direction, following which a slender humanoid figure appeared out of thin air, then immediately tried to flee the scene as a streak of silver light. However, right at this moment, a resounding thunderclap rang out, causing the entire space nearby to vibrate audibly. The dozen or so thick arcs of lightning then converged to form a massive black sword that was over 1,000 feet in length. The silver streak of light had been slowed as a result of booming thunderclap that had just erupted, and it was destroyed by the giant sword before the humanoid figure within the silver light even had a chance to cry out. This humanoid figure was naturally none other than the high-grade devilish beast, Ju Yi, who had followed Han Li all the way here using her profound concealment abilities. This woman possessed a mid-spatial tempering stage cultivation base, but she was unable to offer up any resistance in the face of this massive black sword. Both the silver-armored man and the azure Kirin were quite stunned by the power of the gigantic sword, and grim expressions appeared on both of their faces. However, after slaying that silver humanoid figure, the sword didn't immediately return or switch targets to the 2 of them. Instead, it hurtled toward the ground nearby as a massive streak of black light. Both the silver-armored man and the azure Kirin naturally faltered upon seeing this. The black streak of light descended with devastating might, as if it were threatening to part the entire earth. All of a sudden, a crisp ringing sound erupted from underground, following which azure light flashed as 72 small azure swords suddenly emerged from down below. These flying swords were only several inches in length each, but they suddenly converged to form a massive azure sword that was several tens of feet long. At the same time, a rumbling thunderclap rang out, and dazzling golden lightning erupted to strike the giant black sword in a violent manner. Black and golden arcs of lighting intertwined with one another amid an earth-shattering boom, following which the two giant swords became stuck in an impasse. The giant black sword was astonishingly massive, but the azure sword below it seemed to be extremely destructive, and the golden lightning erupting from it was also immensely powerful, thereby allowing it to hold its own during this clash. A hint of surprise flashed past the giant white face, but it then harumphed coldly as black light flashed from its body. Several tens of arcs of black lightning then rose up all around it, as if they were also going to be launched through the air at any moment. However, right in this instant, a streak of azure light erupted from the ground beneath the azure flying sword. Almost at the exact same moment, the gigantic black sword suddenly lit up, and another streak of black sword chi appeared as if it were a shadow of the black sword. The sword chi then appeared above the streak of azure light in a flash before crashing down with ferocious might. A crisp clang rang out, and the azure light faded to reveal a strange crystalline light barrier. The streak of sword chi struck the light barrier, only to be refracted off to the side. Meanwhile, a humanoid figure stood within the light barrier with his hands clasped behind his back. It was none other than Han Li, who'd been buried under a tomb of giant rocks. He cast his gaze toward the giant face, then at the silver-armored man and the Kirin projection, before waving a hand through the air. A fist-sized ball golden flower instantly flew out of the ground nearby, before flying toward him in a flash. It was none other than the gold-devouring beetle that Han Li had deployed for tracking purposes. The beetle swayed before disappearing up Han Li's sleeve, and the wisp of spiritual sense he'd imbued within it also returned to him. Thus, he instantly received all of the visual and auditory information that the golden devour beetle had gleaned, and his expression abruptly changed slightly. After Han Li had withstood the giant face's attack with ease, the latter didn't immediately unleash another attack. Instead, it was appraising Han Li with a dark expression, seemingly rather wary of him. After a short while, the massive face asked in a dark voice, "The aura of that devilish ape has vanished. Could it be that you killed it?" "Oh, your sensory abilities sure are quite potent. Indeed, the devilish ape was wiped off the face of this realm not long ago," Han Li replied in a slow voice. "HMPH, you're a lucky little brat. I lured the devilish ape to this place so it would stay here to recover from its injuries, and after attaining a true spirit body, I was going to devour it as medicine. The idiot thought that the pure and abundant devilish chi here was a naturally occurring phenomenon." The monstrous face harumphed coldly. Han Li's expression changed slightly upon hearing this, but it then quickly reverted back to normal as he said, "I see. No wonder the devilish chi here is so abundant. I was thinking that it would be quite difficult for the devilish ape to gather so much devilish chi with its severe injuries, so you're the one behind this all along. Now, I'm really curious about just what kind of being you are. Could it be that you're a spirit of heaven and earth?" "What spirit of heaven and earth? This thing is supposed to be an idiotic being with no spiritual nature at all that was only born from the true spirit essence within it, and it's only attained this level of intelligence after being possessed by something else. Take care not to be fooled by this thing, Brother Han," the Azure Kirin suddenly said. Upon hearing the pleasant female voice that the Kirin projection had just spoken with, Han Li's expression changed slightly, and asked, "You're still Fairy Xian right now, right?" "Of course, Senior. My current state is rather strange as there are two different spiritual senses within my body, but my consciousness is the one controlling this Kirin projection." The Azure Kirin sighed in a truthful manner. "So that means you lured me all the way just so you could get your hands on this so-called true Kirin essence, right? Could it be that you were lying all along when you said you could use a holy-grade devilish core to repair the suit of devilish armor?" Han Li turned to the Azure Kirin in a completely emotionless manner. "Of course not. A holy-grade devilish core is very much necessary to repair the heavenly devilish armor. As for the matter surrounding the true Kirin essence, I'll admit that I did indeed use you to achieve my objective, but this isn't directly detrimental to you in any way. On top of that, you were able to slay the holy-grade devilish ape, so it had to be true that it really was severely wounded," Xianxia countered in a pitiable voice. "You're right, your plan wasn't really detrimental to me in any way, but it looks like things aren't progressing all that smoothly here for you." A peculiar look appeared on Han Li's face as he looked at the silver-armored man's 3 avatars, then down at the monstrous face. "Indeed, I didn't think that things would become like this. However, if we can kill the cave spirit down below, we can still obtain the true Kirin essence. The essence is a manifestation of a wisp of the true spirit Kirin's essential power back when it was first born. Any being who obtains it can transform their bodies and attain incredible benefits from it. Not taking into account other matters, if you were to obtain even just a wisp of this essence, you'll definitely be able to progress to the body integration stage in the future, Brother Han." Xianxia wasn't beating around the bush at all, as she immediately revealed her objective for this trip. In this current situation, it was unrealistic for her to think that she'd be able to take the true Kirin essence for herself. She was the weakest among all of the beings present, so it was a good idea for her to recruit Han Li to her side as a powerful ally. "What are you trying to say? Do you intend to split the true Kirin essence with that man as well? If so, you have to split your half with him. I'm not splitting my half with anyone," the silver-armored man said in a cold voice. "That's no problem at all. Brother Han, I want to make another deal with you. Help me kill this cave spirit and I'll give you a wisp of the true Kirin essence. You don't possess the spiritual sense of a true Kirin within your body, so just a wisp of the essence is enough. Absorbing too much will be of detriment to you instead. Furthermore, there's a special method required to refine this essence, and I'll be disclosing that to you as well," Xianxia tempted. And Li's eyes narrowed slightly upon hearing this. The prospect of being able to progress to the body integration stage was naturally quite an alluring one, but this was the first time that he had heard of this true Kirin essence, so he was naturally rather skeptical of it. However, before Han Li had a chance to make a decision, the giant face down below suddenly cackled. "Do you really think you still have a chance to split the true Kirin essence among you? Time is up for the two of you. Do you feel something wrong with your bodies?" Xianxia and the silver-armored man were both quite startled to hear this, and they naturally withdrew their spiritual sense to assess their internal condition. Almost at the exact same moment, the silver-armored man's 2 humanoid avatars let loose cries of agony, and countless hair-like black threads erupted from their skin. The black threads then tore their bodies into countless pieces, and 2 giant sea urchin-like objects remained in their place. The 2 balls of green flames that were the wood of the avatars were also punctured by black threads, and they were absorbed amid flashes of black light before they could get away. The silver worm that was the silver-armored man's true body didn't suffer the same fate. However, the same black threads had also surfaced all over its shimmering silver scales, and it let loose a low roar before plummeting heavily down onto the ground below. As for the azure Kirin projection, it had also been punctured by countless black threads, and had shrunk down to around 10 feet in size. Following a final flash of azure light, it reverted back to Xianxia's original form. At this moment, her entire body was enshrouded within a ball of bright azure light that was engaged in an arduous struggle for supremacy against the countless black threads emerging from her body. She didn't plummet from the sky, but her body was trembling uncontrollably, and her face was twisted with extreme agony that appeared to have also completely immobilized her. Han Li's expression faltered slightly upon seeing this. "Impossible! When did you do this to us?" Xianxia let loose a cry of shock and fury as she struggled to hold her own body together. "When? Of course it's when the 2 of you entered my body. Otherwise, how else do you think I killed all of the other beings that came for the true Kirin essence? As long as you enter my body, it's a simple task to plant spirit seeds within your bodies. Even though the 2 of you haven't died yet, you're no different from wooden puppets at this point. Now then, all I have to do is get rid of that meddling brat, and this will be a resounding success for me." As soon as its voice trailed off, a sinister look appeared on the giant face. All of a sudden, thunderclaps erupted all over its body as arcs of black lightning transformed into countless black swords that hurtled toward Han Li with devastating might. As the black swords flew through the air, they suddenly dispersed before rotating like windmills. At the same time, arcs of black lightning erupted from the swords amid resounding thunderclaps, connecting with one another to form a massive black net that was around an acre in area in the blink of an eye. The giant net immediately descended upon Han Li from all sides, leaving him with no avenue for escape. "This is a sword formation," Han Li murmured to himself as a peculiar look appeared on his face. The monstrous face began to chant a string of strange incantations, and rumbling thunderclaps immediately rang out as arcs of black lightning flashed violently. The entire net of lightning began to converge toward the center, spurred on by the hundreds of black lightning swords. The peculiar expression on Han Li's face faded in a flash, as he made a grabbing motion toward a certain direction. Immediately thereafter, the giant azure sword swayed before disappearing on the spot. In the next instant, spatial fluctuations erupted before Han Li, and the massive azure sword reappeared. He pointed a finger at the sword, and it reverted back into 72 small azure swords amid a clear ringing sound before revolving all around its body. Han Li made a hand seal, and the flying swords shuddered before quickly multiplying in numbers. All of a sudden, hundreds of identical streaks of sword chi appeared, and brilliant azure light erupted from them, which transformed into a giant azure lotus flower that enveloped Han Li's entire body. The petals of the lotus flower rotated, and streaks of azure sword chi shot forth upward in all directions like a reverse torrential downpour. A string of muffled thumps rang out as the black net of lightning was shattered by the streaks of azure sword chi, as if it were a papier-mâché structure. However, before a smile had even appeared on Han Li's face, a loud thunderclap rang out, and the shattered arcs of black lightning converged again to form an identical black net, which continued to close in on Han Li. Han Li's expression changed drastically upon seeing this. At the same time, the monstrous face let loose a sinister cackle, and its massive body twisted and warped before it grew four thick limbs amid a flash of brilliant black light. At the same time, its portly and bloated body also became strong and muscly-bound as it transformed into a shimmering black kirin. The kirin was several thousand feet tall, and from afar, it was as if it were a massive black mountain that was even larger than its original form. The massive monstrous face was situated right on the kirin's forehead, creating quite an eye-catching and unsettling sight to behold. After completing its transformation, the black kirin raised one of its front limbs before stomping down toward Han Li from afar. All of a sudden, violent spatial fluctuations erupted over 100 feet above Han Li, and black light flashed as a gargantuan inky black paw appeared out of thin air. Before it had even crashed down onto Han Li, a burst of enormous invisible power descended upon him first. Han Li felt the surrounding space tighten around him, as if a massive steel casket had closed around his body, trying to completely immobilize him. The massive black paw descended from above, and at the same time, the net of black lightning was also upon him. In this dire situation, Han Li remained completely unflustered. He merely took a deep breath, and scintillating golden light erupted from his body along with countless golden scales, as well as pairs of shimmering golden arms. A string of resounding booms rang out as Han Li used his immense strength to shatter the invisible shackles around him. Immediately thereafter, one of Han Li's hands took on an inky black color, and he suddenly made a grabbing motion. A massive gray hand that was around 10 feet in size appeared out of thin air, and the 5 fingers spread open with gray light shimmering around them before meeting the oncoming black paw. Despite the vast disparity in their sizes, the large gray hand was able to keep the black paw at bay after a thunderous collision. Black and gray light intertwined with one another as explosions rang out incessantly, and a strange shockwave also erupted into the heavens around them. At the same time, the giant azure lotus flower revolved around Han Li, and loud thunderclaps erupted as countless golden arcs of lightning surfaced. In the blink of an eye, a golden lightning lotus flower took shape outside the azure lotus flower. The petals of the golden flower flashed, and a layer of shimmering golden arcs of lightning proliferated in all directions, crashing into the converging black arcs of lightning amid a string of deafening thunderclaps. As soon as the two types of lightning came into contact with one another, they intertwined and clashed as if they'd each encountered their mortal enemy. Countless sparks of electricity flashed amid black and golden light before exploding on after the other, and both of the monstrous faces' devastating attacks were kept at bay by Han Li. The giant face faltered upon seeing this, but it then immediately let loose a cold harumph as a frosty light flashed through its eyes. Immediately thereafter, it opened its cavernous mouth, and gusts of black wind surged forth from within as a black hole that was around an acre in area appeared before the black kirin. Black light was swirling rapidly within the hole, and it seemed as if it were threatening to suck in everything in this entire world. Xianxia was still completely immobilized, but a panicked look appeared on her face upon seeing this, and she hurriedly yelled, "Look out! That's the great engulfment technique." Back when she was in her Azure Kirin form, she had also fallen prey to the same ability, but the version being unleashed by this black Kirin now was far more powerful than what she'd experienced. Han Li was also quite startled by this attack, and after hearing Xianxia's words of warning, he immediately flipped a hand over to produce a miniature black mountain that was several inches in size, then hurled it into the air. Immediately after leaving his hand, the mountain swayed before swelling drastically in size, reaching over 10,000 feet tall in just the span of a few breaths. At this point, it was comparable in size to the black Kirin up ahead, and most of the entire sky was obscured by the giant black mountain peak. He was planning to use this devastatingly powerful mountain to crush the black hole, along with the black Kirin's entire body. However, the scenes that unfolded next had Han Li's expression changing drastically. A vast expanse of black light suddenly erupted from the massive black hole, and after striking the divine essence-effused mountain, the black light transformed into several black runes that were each around 10 feet in size, all of which disappeared into the mountain in a flash. Immediately thereafter, the mountain shrank rapidly down to its original miniature size, then disappeared amid a flash of black light. In the next instant, the treasure appeared at the edge of the black hole before being forcibly drawn into it. Han Li was astonished to find that in that instant, his connection with the divine essence-effused mountain had become extremely feeble, as if it were on the verge of being severed entirely. He had already refined this mountain to the extent that it was virtually an extension of his own body, so it was quite incredible that his opponent was still able to forcibly take it from him. Thus, a grim expression appeared on Han Li's face, and he began to chant something, upon which silver light flashed from the back of his inky black hand. A miniature mountain projection immediately appeared, and following a flash of gray light, the projection took on a substantial form as the black mountain surfaced over his palm again, as if it had never been hurled through the air in the first place. A faint cry of surprise escaped the monstrous face's mouth upon seeing this. It was naturally unaware that the divine essence-effused mountain had been refined using the 100 Meridian Refinement mantra, so unless Han Li's entire hand were to be chopped off, he'd be able to summon the mountain back to him, even from vast distances away. However, just as Han Li was about to unleash another ability, the true might of the Great Engulfment technique was finally unveiled. Following a burst of unsettling cackling, the light in the surrounding area dimmed, and a gust of putrid wind swept toward Han Li, following which he found himself in an entirely inky black space. The black lightning and the giant paw had abruptly disappeared, and Han Li's heart jolted as he discovered that he was unable to release his spiritual sense of his body at all. Blue light immediately flashed through his eyes as he hurriedly inspected his surroundings, and he discovered that even after unleashing his spirit eye ability, he was only able to just barely catch a blurry glimpse of the area within a radius of 1,000 feet. However, everything around him was a vast expanse of murky darkness, and it was as if he'd been drawn into an unknown space. Despite this, Han Li was confident that he hadn't moved a single inch from his original spot, which meant that he'd most likely been swallowed into the monster's stomach. This great engulfment technique really was extremely profound. He didn't even get a chance to take evasive measures before he fell prey to it. With that in mind, the azure and golden lotus flowers beneath his feet blossomed in a flash, forming two light barriers around him. Furthermore, there was also a crystalline light barrier that had appeared around his body as the innermost layer of protection. He had witnessed what had just happened to Xianxia and the silver-armored man, so he was naturally proceeding with extreme caution. Even so, Han Li certainly wasn't going to just be content with being trapped in here. As such, he flicked his 10 fingers through the air in quick succession, and streaks of sharp sword chi shot forth all around him in a torrential downpour. However, all of these streaks of sword chi simply disappeared amid dull thumps after flying for over 1,000 feet, as if they'd all fallen into an inescapable swamp. Han Li's expression darkened upon seeing this, and he made a hand seal that gathered all of the golden arcs of lightning around him toward his body. Immediately thereafter, a loud thunderclap rang out as a golden lightning worm that was over 100 feet in length took shape, then pounced forward in a flash. A resounding boom rang out as the golden worm crashed into some kind of restriction over 1,000 feet away, and a golden halo exploded like a supernova, sending waves of golden lightning radiating in all directions. The entire space tremored violently as if it were about to completely collapse in the next instant, but a sharp cry suddenly rang out as another black hole that was over 100 feet in size appeared before the waves of golden light. Black light swirled within the black hole, and all of the golden light disappeared into it, along with the shockwaves resulting from the explosion. Immediately thereafter, the black hole twisted and warped before transforming into a black-robed man wearing a white mask on his face. And Lee raised an eyebrow as he narrowed his eyes upon seeing this man. "There's no way you're going to be able to escape from here. The other two were able to escape as I intended for them to do so, but you're not going anywhere," the black-robed man said in a muffled voice that was identical to that of the monstrous face. "Really? I don't think so." A peculiar look flashed through Han Li's eyes before he let loose a cold harumph. The harumph seemed to be quite ordinary, but the black-robed figure abruptly shuddered over 1,000 feet away before plummeting from the sky like a dead log. Han Li had unleashed his Spirit Stun Thorn ability, and the black-robed man had been caught completely off guard. Immediately thereafter, a loud thunderclap erupted from behind Han Li, following which a pair of translucent wings appeared on his back. He flapped the wings gently and abruptly disappeared on the spot. In the next instant, an arc of azure and white lightning flashed beside the plummeting black-robed man, following which Han Li reappeared out of thin air. An azure longsword then appeared soundlessly in his hand, and he slashed it through the air to slice both the black-robed man and his mask in half. After that, Han Li immediately rubbed his hands together before raising them in unison, sending arcs of golden lightning hurtling through the air. The two halves of the black-robed man's body were reduced to balls of black chi amid rumbling thunderclaps, and it appeared that he was going to be completely destroyed in the next instant. Han Li was quite relieved to see this, and a hint of a smile finally appeared on his face. However, his smile stiffened in the next instant as he discovered that the black chi within the golden lightning had suddenly fled the scene as a series of black snakes. His divine Devilbane lightning was indeed extremely powerful, but it still only managed to cut off most of those black snakes, thereby allowing a small portion of them to escape. After that, these black snakes all transformed into short humanoid figures. These humanoid figures were all identical in appearance to the black-robed man, except they were only around a foot tall each, but there were over 100 of them. These black-robed figures blurred in a wraith-like manner, and in the next instant, Han Li found himself surrounded by these black-robed midgets. Cold light flashed through these black-robed figures' eyes in unison, and all of them raised their hands at once to send pillars of black light hurtling directly toward Han Li. However, the pillar of black light all disappeared like sandcastles in the rising tide after coming into contact with the barrier of gray light around Han Li's body. The black-robed midgets were all rather taken aback by this development, while a cold smile appeared on Han Li's face. His divine essence-effused light was the bane of all 5 elemental powers, and those pillars of black light were imbued with extremely pure water attribute spiritual power, thereby making the divine essence-effused light the bane of their existence. At this moment, Han Li suddenly stomped a foot down onto his azure lotus flower, and countless streaks of azure light shot forth in a torrential downpour. All of the black-robed midgets in the surrounding area were punctured countless times by these streaks of light, thereby reducing them to clouds of black chi again. "Cuckoo, just give up, little brat. Here in my body, my soul is immortal. You'll only be making more enemies for yourself by destroying our bodies." A burst of unpleasant cackling rang out from the darkness. Sure enough, the clouds of black chi flashed again to form several hundred more black-robed beings. Except on this occasion, they were only around several inches tall each. Han Li's eyelids twitched upon seeing this, following which a cold light flashed through his eyes. He then flipped his hand over to produce a golden blade segment. It was none other than the incomplete profound heavenly treasure he just obtained earlier. He didn't know what the monstrous face intended by trapping him in here, but he certainly wasn't going to allow it to get its way. Using this blade segment would most likely expend a vast amount of his magic power, as well as the power of his projection, but there was no way that his opponent would be able to withstand the power of laws. He was going to kill this monster in a single strike to put an end to this battle. However, just as golden light was beginning to flash from the blade segment, a loud cry that was filled with excitement and impatience suddenly rang out from within his sleeve. Han Li faltered slightly upon hearing this, and a peculiar look appeared on his face before he immediately swept a sleeve through the air. A strange cry rang out as a black bracelet flew out of his sleeve, and a streak of black light erupted from within it. The black light then faded to reveal a small black monkey that appeared before Han Li. It was none other than the Weeping Soul Beast. However, the Weeping Soul Beast was clearly far different from how it normally was at the moment. Before Han Li had even issued any instructions to it using his spiritual sense, it let loose a thunderous roar, and black light swirled around its body as it swelled drastically to become a massive black ape that was over 300 feet tall. The Weeping Soul Beast's eyes took on a crimson color, and it thumped its massive fists into its chest as it bared its sharp fangs. At the same time, a strange horn had sprouted from its head, and it had transformed into a massive three-eyed ghostly being. There were also 3 black bone spikes on its back that were extremely terrifying to behold. Zing Beast! A sharp cry of horror suddenly rang out within the darkness, and all of the miniature black-robed figures instantly disappeared as clouds of black chi. Han Li's eyes widened with surprise upon witnessing this unexpected development, and he was also rather confused. At this point, the giant ghostly being that was the Weeping Soul Beast seemed to have lost all semblance of sanity. After letting loose a thunderous roar of fury, spiritual light suddenly flashed from its third demonic eye, following which a crimson pillar of light pierced into the darkness up ahead in a flash. A strange sound rang out, and Han Li was given quite a fright by what happened next. Several hundred feet away, something appeared directly in the path of the pillar of crimson light, and the latter instantly transformed into a crimson chain. The chain wound itself tightly around the object that had just appeared. Following, a loud thunderclap rang out as arcs of crimson lightning erupted from the chain. A howl of anguish immediately rang out from the end of the chain, and a ball of black chi with a radius of several tens of feet was forced to reveal itself amid flashes of crimson lightning. The crimson chain immediately became very excited and instantly wound itself in a few more loops around the cloud of black chi, as if it had captured a rare delicacy. Rumbling thunderclaps erupted, and the black chi howled incessantly, seemingly extremely fearful toward the arcs of crimson lightning. In just the span of a few breaths, it adopted a dozen or so different forms to try and escape with all its might. The black-robed man and the black Kirin were among the forms that it adopted. However, all of its efforts were completely in vain, as every form it adopted was shattered by the arcs of crimson lightning, thereby reducing it to a cloud of black chi over and over again. Furthermore, the crimson chains adhered tightly to the ball of black chi, refusing to allow it to escape. Thus, the black chi could only thrash violently while howling in agony and fury. Right at this moment, the Weeping Soul Beast sprang into action again. It suddenly made a grabbing motion behind it with one of its huge furry hands, and one of the 3 black bone spikes on its back suddenly disappeared without any premonition. In the next instant, black light flashed from the Weeping Soul Beast's hand, and the bone spike appeared in its grasp. It then began to chant an incantation that Han Li had never heard before, and rows of shimmering golden text suddenly appeared over the bone spike, creating quite a mystical sight to behold. The bone spike then began to tremor gently while emitting a buzzing sound, and it was also expanding at a gradual rate. At the same time, golden waves surged backward from the tip of the spike, and a burst of scintillating golden light erupted. Some of the golden runes on the bone spike also appeared in the air nearby, hovering around in an unsteady manner. Right in the instant when those runes had appeared, a burst of bone-chilling baleful chi erupted from the bone spike. Golden seal text, Han Li exclaimed in astonishment. At the same time, a stunned voice also rang out from within the cloud of black chi. Heavenly punishment, divine spear. The difference was that Han Li was only purely shocked, yet the voice within the black chi was filled with both shock and horror. Countless thoughts raced through Han Li's mind, yet before he could make sense of what was happening, a sudden turn of events abruptly. Golden light suddenly began to swirl unsteadily around the cloud of black chi, following which it rapidly shrank before quickly swelling again. A dull thump then rang out as the cloud of black chi self-detonated, and an inky black halo emerged, forcing the crimson chains away. Countless streaks of black light then took advantage of this opportunity to escape from those chains. In this dire situation, the monstrous face had self-detonated most of its soul so that a small portion of it could escape. However, an incredible scene then immediately ensued. The crimson chains suddenly blurred after being forced back, then transformed into several tens of crimson threads that shot forth in a flash. Each and every crimson thread pierced through a streak of black light with unerring accuracy and incredible speed. All of these streaks of black light were forced to revert back to balls of black chi amid anguished wails, and at the same time, they were immobilized in midair. The crimson threads then converged and forcibly gathered all of the black chi in one place, following which they transformed into a thick crimson chain that bound the cloud of black chi again. Immediately thereafter, the bone spike in the weeping soul beast's hand was hurled through the air as a streak of golden light. It wasn't traveling all that quickly, but the cloud of black chi was completely immobilized, so it was unable to take any evasive measures. All of a sudden, an unfamiliar face suddenly appeared out of the black chi. In contrast with the white monstrous face from before, this face was of 5 different colors and had a pair of horns growing on its forehead. The entire face had been enshrouded within a ball of scorching crimson flames, and there were 2 balls of rapidly revolving silver light within the black eye socket, striking the beholder with a dizzying sensation. The monstrous face from before bore a slight resemblance to a human face, but this was a devilish face, the likes of which Han Li had never seen before. "Please spare me and stop that Xing beast, esteemed immortal. I'm a soul fragment of a heavenly devilish sovereign, and I'm willing to submit to you and become your devilish servant." The devilish face was completely desperate at this point, and was grasping at the final straw that could perhaps save its life. Heavenly devilish sovereign. Han Li was quite startled to hear this, and he was rather tempted by this offer. However, he then cast his gaze toward the weeping soul beast, and he could only heave a resigned sigh. The weeping soul beast had completely cut off its spiritual connection with him, and it seemed that it had been acting on pure instinct this entire time, so how was he supposed to control it? Thus, the devilish face could only look on in despair as the bone spike pierced through its glabella, and scintillating golden light erupted from the puncture wound in a frenzy. In the next instant, the golden light enveloped the devilish face, which instantly completely stiffened as if it had been turned into stone. Following a crisp crack, the devilish face shattered with the golden hole at the center, disintegrating into countless 5-colored fragments that hovered in a stationary manner within the black chi. The weeping soul beast's eyes lit up, and it let loose a cold harumph to expel a burst of yellow light out of its large nostrils. The yellow light swept forth to collect the black chi and the fragments of the devilish face, then drew it all back into the weeping soul beast's waiting mouth. The crimson chains disappeared thereafter, and the bone spike that had just been hurled suddenly reappeared on the weeping soul beast's back. However, the golden seal text on it had disappeared, and the black light emanating from it had also dimmed to the point that it was almost non-existent. Much to Han Li's surprise, right after devouring the devilish face, the crimson light faded from the weeping soul beast's eyes, and it blinked as if it were confused about how it had gotten here, then slumped to the ground, completely unconscious. A layer of black light surged over its massive body, and it reverted back to its small black monkey form, which was only around a foot in size. At the same time, the spiritual connection Han Li had with the beast was restored. Han Li faltered momentarily before sweeping his spiritual sense toward the little monkey, and he was quite shocked to discover that the weeping soul beast's energy and spiritual sense had been completely drained, as if it had just endured a fierce battle for 3 days and 3 nights. Han Li was rather bewildered by this situation, and he simply couldn't make sense of what had just happened. The weeping soul beast's strange transformation, and the devilish face's claim that it was the soul fragment of a heavenly devilish sovereign, all had him feeling quite confused. Furthermore, the fact that the devilish face seemed to have recognized the weeping soul beast and referred to it as a Xing beast only further exacerbated his befuddlement. However, he was also aware that this was not the time to be searching for answers, as all of a sudden, the black space around him began to shatter amid violent tremors. A ray of white light shone into this space, and Han Li's brows furrowed as he inspected his surroundings, only to find that there was no true Kirin essence to be seen. He abruptly swept a sleeve through the air to stow the weeping soul beast away up his sleeve, then swayed and disappeared on the spot. In the next instant, spatial fluctuations erupted in the air several thousand feet above the ground, and Han Li appeared amid a flash of azure light. Down below was a gray face that was several thousand feet in size. The face was missing large chunks, and it was quickly collapsing in the wind. Han Li quickly inspected his surroundings through narrowed eyes to find that Xianxia was hovering in midair some distance below him. She had been completely immobilized before, but she seemed to be fine now. There were several shimmering white flying sabers hovering around her, and she was looking on at the scenes unfolding before her eyes with astonishment etched on her face. Not far away from her stood the silver-armored man with his hands clasped behind his back. There was a silver worm projection above his head, and the two of them seemed to be engaged in a tense confrontation. Xianxia took a deep breath before asking, "Brother Han, did you manage to kill the cave spirit?" The silver-armored man was also appraising him, with a hint of bewilderment in his eyes. "Why do you ask? Is it so incredible to the two of you that I managed to kill that thing?" Han Li asked in an indifferent voice. Xianxia quickly recomposed herself before replying with a smile, "Of course not. I'm simply overawed that you were able to kill it so quickly, Brother Han." Han Li merely smiled and didn't offer any explanation. At this moment the silver-armored man suddenly asked in a cold voice, "Seeing as you've killed the cave spirit, where's the true Kirin essence? Have you obtained it already?" Han Li wore a calm expression on his face, and as opposed to answering the man's question, he asked, "I did indeed manage to kill the cave spirit, but do you know what it was that had possessed the cave spirit?" Both Xianxia and the silver-armored man's expressions changed slightly as they exchanged a quick glance upon hearing this. After a brief silence, Xianxia asked, "Would you care to enlighten us, Brother Han?" Before the cave spirit died, it proclaimed itself to be a soul fragment of a heavenly devilish sovereign. "Do you two know anything about this?" Han Li asked in a nonchalant manner. "A heavenly devilish sovereign? That's impossible." Both Xianxia and the silver-armored man exclaimed in unison with astonishment and horror etched on their faces. "Oh, this is the first time I've heard of this heavenly devilish sovereign, but both of you seem to be quite familiar with it. Would you be able to fill me in on this topic?" Han Li raised an eyebrow as he cast his gaze directly toward the two of them. The silver-armored man's expression darkened, and he merely harumphed coldly, seemingly not intending to answer Han Li's question. Following a brief hesitation, Xianxia explained, "I trust that you already know what a heavenly devilish monarch is, Brother Han. A heavenly devilish sovereign is a top-grade being among heavenly devilish monarchs. They possess countless different forms, and even true spirit beings are susceptible to them during their tribulation transcendences. If they were to fall prey to a heavenly devilish sovereign, they'd undergo devilification and be reduced to puppets. Even true spirits are susceptible to them." Han Li was quite astonished to hear this. Not just true spirits, it's said that even the immortals of the true immortal realm could be forced to undergo devilification by a heavenly devilish sovereign. Of course, this is only a rumor. No one has been able to confirm it to be true or false. Speaking of which, is it really true that this cave spirit was possessed by a heavenly devilish sovereign? Xianxia explained with a wry smile, and at the end, she couldn't help but ask for confirmation. Han Li was naturally stunned upon hearing this information about these heavenly devilish sovereigns, but his expression remained unchanged as he countered, "Do you think I'm lying to you, Fairy Xian?" "Of course not. It's just that this is quite an important matter, and I simply wanted to confirm this just to make sure I hadn't misheard." Before Xian had a chance to say anything else, the silver-armored being interjected in an expressionless manner, "I think he's most likely telling the truth." Not only was Han Li rather surprised to hear this, Xianxia was also quite taken aback as she asked, "What do you mean by that, fellow Taoist Gui?" "HMPH, you won't fool me by playing dumb. Don't tell me that you didn't notice anything strange about the cave spirit. You should be well aware that spirits of heaven and earth like this true spirit can't be possessed by normal beings, not even true spirit Kirins themselves. On top of that, that thing was most likely telling the truth when claiming that it had killed many beings like us already." The silver-armored man harumphed coldly. "Even so, how did it find out about the true spirit cave and true Kirin essence?" Xianxia rebuked with a shake of her head. "That's rather difficult to speculate. Perhaps when this soul fragment of the heavenly devilish sovereign came to our realm, it unintentionally devoured one of the other 100,000 true spirit Kirin soul fragments, thereby giving it knowledge of this place. Alternatively, perhaps it really was a coincidence, and it stumbled upon this cave spirit first, then learned about the secret of this true spirit cave after devouring other beings," the silver-armored man mused in a dark voice. "Those scenarios do indeed seem plausible, but we can find out the truth, can't we? If I recall correctly, all living beings that have been possessed by heavenly devilish sovereigns will disintegrate into devilish dust. The cave spirit is quite a special being, but it wouldn't have been able to escape that fate either." Xianxia cast her gaze downward as she spoke. Han Li also looked down with a curious expression, and he was shocked to find that a massive pile of black dust had appeared on the ground where the monstrous face had been before. Only after expending extensive effort did Han Li manage to glean a slight semblance of the monstrous face from the pile of black dust, and his lips twitch involuntarily in response. The other two had naturally also witnessed this. Xianxia merely heaved a faint sigh before falling silent, while the silver-armored man raised a hand and made a grabbing motion downward. A clump of black dust instantly flew toward him as a stream of black smoke, and carefully inspected it for a long while before finally concluding in a calm manner. There's no mistaking it. This is indeed devilish dust. It appears that Brother Han was telling the truth then. No wonder this cave spirit was so difficult to deal with. The two of us unwittingly fell into the heavenly devilish sovereign's trap, and we almost perished as a result. Come to think of it, I really must thank you for saving me, Brother Han. Xianxia turned to Han Li with a grateful smile. There's no need to thank me. I was only able to slay this devil through sheer luck. Otherwise, this devilish sovereign's abilities would have been very difficult to combat. Han Li's lips twitched in involuntarily as he recalled back to the ordeal he'd suffered within the monstrous face's body, and there was still a hint of fear lingering in his heart. Of course, thankfully, this cave spirit isn't an actual being with a substantial body, so the soul fragment of the devilish sovereign was only able to unleash a small portion of its power through it. Otherwise, heavenly devilish sovereigns are virtually just as powerful as true immortals. Even beings that have only been possessed by one of its soul fragments would definitely be far too fearsome for us to oppose. However, you've most likely made yourself a powerful enemy here, fellow Taoist Han. The heavenly devilish sovereign to which this soul fragment belongs will be seeking its revenge. So if you ever make it to a point where you can ascend to the true immortal realm, it will most likely return to try and interfere with your tribulation, the silver-armored man said as a cold light flashed through his eyes. I'm not going to think about something so far away, Han Li chuckled in a nonchalant manner. All right, seeing fellow Taoist Xian and I have answered your questions, it's time we talked about the true Kirin essence, isn't it? The silver-armored man chuckled coldly as he changed the subject. I don't know what this true Kirin essence looks like, but I definitely didn't see it within the cave spirit's body, Han Li replied in a concise manner. The silver-armored man's expression immediately darkened upon hearing this, and Xianxia's brows also furrowed in contemplation. Strangely enough, neither of them were enraged by skeptical of his claim. Han Li's eyes narrowed in befuddlement upon seeing this. What do you think, fellow Taoist Gui? Xianxia suddenly asked with a smile. I'm indeed unable to detect any true Kirin essence fluctuations from fellow Taoist Han's body. The essence comes from the true spirit Kirin itself, so there's no way to fool us using any treasures or restrictions, which means he's telling the truth. However, back when we were battling the cave spirit, we both sensed the essence within its body, the silver-armored man replied. That means you've arrived at the same conclusion as I have, fellow Taoist Gui. Xianxia's expression immediately paled upon hearing this. Indeed, seeing as fellow Taoist Han hasn't obtained the true Kirin essence, it must have dissipated and returned to the earth following the cave spirit's death, or returned to the original true spirit cave, and the only way to obtain it would be to wait for the next cave spirit to be born, the silver-armored man confirmed with a dark expression. If it's the first scenario, then we won't have any more chances, but if the second scenario was what actually happened, then we'll just have to wait for a few hundred years, Xianxia said with a hint of forced optimism in her voice. Oh, in that case, is there a way to find out which of the two scenarios actually took place? Han Li asked as he crossed his arms and stroked his chin. Of course not. There's no way to track the true Kirin essence regardless of what happened, Xianxia replied in a dejected manner. Han Li was also quite disappointed to hear this. After all, that essential power could assist him in reaching the body integration stage, but now, even if the true Kirin essence still existed, he'd have to wait several hundred years for a chance to obtain it. However, even though neither Xianxia nor the silver-armored man seemed to be lying, he naturally wasn't just going to take their word for it. Thus, blue light flashed through his eyes, and he also released his spiritual sense as he rose up into the air to search through the nearby area. However, after scouring carefully through the area in a radius of several kilometers, his search still proved to be completely fruitless, so he could only descend before Xianxia and the silver-armored man again in a gloomy manner. At the sight of Han Li's dejected display, Xianxia and silver-armored man were even more convinced that he had been telling the truth. Thus, all three of them fell silent as they became absorbed in their own thoughts. For Xianxia, her trip had ended in complete failure, and she'd wasted several precious treasures in the process, so she was understandably quite depressed. The silver-armored man remained relatively calm, but he was also pondering something. After a while, the silver-armored man seemed to have seen the silver lightning on the situation, and he suddenly chuckled. Hee, looks like this trip made in vain. Thankfully, I possessed a silver worm, so waiting several hundred years is nothing to me. You're a silver worm, so even after waiting for so long, you still have a chance to reach the holy race and even beyond. If I were to wait for several centuries, even if I could obtain the true Kirin essence, I may not have enough time to completely refine it and use it in my cultivation. Xianxia sighed with a complex expression on her face. In that case, why don't you give up or become one with me? The silver-armored man suddenly suggested upon hearing this. I can certain fuse my spiritual sense with yours. As long as you'll allow me to take over as the dominant consciousness, I'll take you up on your offer right away, Xianxia countered with a dark expression. HMPH, I tried to throw you a lifeline, but you seem intent on bringing punishment upon yourself. A vicious light suddenly flashed through the silver-armored man's eyes, and he clenched his fists together as a faint odor of blood and gore began to emanate from his body. Xianxia's heart stirred slightly upon seeing this, but she didn't back down in the slightest as she said, "Do you think you can take on myself and Brother Han at once, fellow Taoist Gui?" A cold light flashed through the silver-armored man's eyes, and he turned to Han Li as he asked, "Fellow Taoist Han, are you going to intervene? If you leave right now, I'll be sure to give you a handsome reward." A handsome reward? Han Li merely chuckled upon hearing this. "Do you not believe me, fellow Taoist Han? In that case, I'm willing to issue part of the reward in advance," the silver-armored man insisted with a cold expression on his face. "Brother Han, only I've conducted enough research into the heavenly devilish armor to be able to repair it. If you help me here, not only will I repair the armor for you, I'll take you here to search for the true Kirin essence again in a few hundred years, and I'm willing to split it with you." Xianxia remained completely calm and unflustered, seemingly very confident that Han Li would help her. Just as she'd expected, Han Li only hesitated momentarily before shaking his head as he said, "I'm afraid I won't be able to just stand by idly here. If you know what's good for you, I suggest you leave, fellow Taoist Gui." The silver-armored man was furious upon hearing this, and a ferocious look appeared on his face as the odor of blood and gore in the air intensified. Han Li's eyes narrowed, and a rumbling thunderclap erupted within his as arcs of golden lightning appeared all around him. At the same time, a golden projection with 3 heads and 6 arms emerged behind his back. Simultaneously, several tens of azure flying swords flew out of his sleeves, then transformed into blossoming azure lotus flowers. Meanwhile, Han Li merely stood with his hands clasped behind his back as he appraised the silver-armored man. A wide smile appeared on Xianxia's face upon seeing this, but she wasn't just going to stand by idly either. She flipped over both of her hands, and an azure talisman with the image of a Kirin inscribed upon it suddenly appeared in one hand, while a small black flag appeared in her other hand amid a flash of spiritual light. Both of the objects were covered in countless runes, and it was quite apparent that they were no ordinary treasures. She waved the 2 objects through the air, and a gust of black winds emerged alongside an azure Kirin projection. Both of them then instantly combined as one, and the Kirin projection was inflated to several times its original size by the gust of black winds. It opened its cavernous mouth and let loose a string of low roars as it appraised the silver-armored man in a menacing manner. The silver-armored man was normally quite a brutal and vicious character, but even he had to hesitate in the face of both Han Li and Xianxia. The latter wasn't enough for him to be concerned about, but the fact that Han Li had taken care of the cave spirit on his own had shaken him quite a bit. He knew that if he were to face the cave spirit on his own, he'd only have a 50% chance of securing victory at most, and that probability was deflated even further by the fact that the cave spirit had been possessed by the soul fragment of a heavenly devilish sovereign. "All right, then, this is where we'll part ways. I hope that you two will both be alive and well the next time I see you," the silver-armored man said in a cold voice as a vicious light flashed through his eyes. Immediately after his voice trailed off, he waved a sleeve through the air to expel a ball of gray chi, which then transformed into a crimson conical flying carriage with ghostly shadows flashing within it. The silver-armored man's body swayed, and he disappeared into the carriage before it sped away as a streak of crimson light, leaving a burst of ghostly howls in its wake. After just a few flashes, the carriage disappeared into the distance without a trace. The silver-armored man had been quite decisive, choosing to immediately back down after deciding that his chances of securing victory were quite slim. Xianxia's expression eased slightly, and she made a hand seal to dispel the Kirin projection up above, which reverted back into a talisman and a small flag before descending into her grasp. She then turned to Han Li and extended a respectful curtsy as she said, "Thank you for stepping in, Brother Han. Otherwise, I would have been in grave danger. HMPH, you seem to trust me a lot. Aren't you afraid that I'll turn on you, then use a soul search technique to obtain the method for repairing the suit of devilish armor?" Han Li harumphed coldly as he shot a glance toward her. Xianxian remained unfazed by Han Li's cold threats as she smiled, and replied, "I haven't known you for very long, but I've interacted with you enough to be able to tell that you're not that heartless of a person. Besides, my cultivation base might be quite lackluster, but I do know a few soul-locking secret techniques. Even if my soul were to be completely destroyed, no one will be able to get any information from me." Han Li was a little speechless upon hearing this. His main objective for making this trip was to repair the suit of heavenly devilish armor, so he didn't want to draw any unnecessary trouble to himself. As for this true Kirin essence, it was the first that he'd heard of such an extraordinary item. In any case, there was no way to obtain it for now, so it would naturally be best to go back and do some research on it for himself. Furthermore, the matters surrounding the heavenly devilish sovereign and the weeping soul beast had him feeling rather bemused, so he had to ponder those issues carefully as well. After a brief silence, Han Li said in an implacable voice, "I'm taking all of the materials from the holy gray devilish ape's body." "No problem. After we go back, not only will I repair the suit of devilish armor for you as I promised, I'll offer you another present as thanks for saving my life," Xianxian replied in an extremely obedient manner. Han Li's expression eased slightly upon hearing her response, and he nodded in reply. Xianxian glanced at the vast expanse of black dust down below, and a hint of dejection flashed through her eyes as she said, "Brother Han, that battle from earlier must have disturbed many devilish beasts in the area, so we should get away from here right away." Han Li quickly assessed their surroundings before nodding as he replied, "We did indeed cause quite a commotion. Let's go then." Thus, the two of them flew through the air as two streaks of light, one white and one azure, heading out of the mountain ranges. Moments later, peace and quiet returned to the area. Around half a day later, Han Li and Xianxian emerged from the mountain ranges and reappeared before the mountain where they'd parted with Yue Zhang. Xianxian abruptly raised a hand, and a streak of silver light shot forth, whizzing around in the nearby area before flying up her sleeve. Her expression changed slightly, and a wry smile appeared on her face as she turned to Han Li and said, "As expected, fellow Taoist Yue has most likely already perished. He must have been killed by either that man with the Gui surname or high-grade devilish beast that was killed by the cave spirit earlier. If we'd known that this would happen, we should have taken him into the mountain ranges with us. As things are now, our return journey may be rather perilous. It's indeed quite unfortunate that fellow Taoist Yue passed away, but even if he'd followed us into the mountain ranges, he wouldn't have been able to enter the devilish Qi passageway, so his death would have been unavoidable anyway. As for our return journey, let's go back the same way we came. After all, we've already taken that route once, and it seems to be relatively safe," Han Li replied after a brief pause. "Looks like we'll have to do that. Let's set off right away," Xianxian sighed. Han Li nodded in response, and the two continued on their journey. Unbeknownst to the two of them, there were hundreds of metamorphosis stage devilish beasts gathered at a certain location countless kilometers away, and all of them were pursuing Han Li along the same route. They were being led by the subordinate of the holy grade myriad I-Devil, the humanoid devilish beast known as Wu Qi. This devilish beast had a pair of black horns on his head and wore a suit of black metal armor. There was a heavy expression on his sinister face, and he was taking occasional glances at a crimson bead that was being held tightly in his hand. The bead was supposed to be quite glittering and translucent, but a deep crack had marred its smooth surface, and it had become completely dull and lusterless. After receiving a request for assistance from Zhu Yi, the holy grade myriad I-Devil was afraid that Han Li would be able to get away, so he'd immediately sent Wu Qi after him. Thus, Wu Qi gathered all of the high-grade devilish beasts in the area to head directly toward the location that had been marked by Zhu Yue. However, not long after he'd set off, the treasure that he'd been using to track her suddenly cracked in half. This came as quite a shock to him, and it meant that Jiu Yi had most likely already perished. In that case, he really wasn't confident that he'd be able to hunt down his target. However, at the recollection of the menacing light that had flashed through his master's eyes prior to his deployment, Wu Qi immediately shuddered involuntarily. He knew with absolute certainty that if he were to return to his master with such an excuse, he'd immediately be torn in half. With that in mind, the devilish beast let loose a low snarl of frustration and urged all of the other devilish beasts behind them to pick up their speed. Thus, devilish winds surged through the air as all of the devilish beasts sped up even further. In the air above an ordinary-looking small valley on the outskirts of the Golden Devil mountain ranges, there were 4 people locked in a tense confrontation. On one side was an elderly man with gray hair and a woman in a palatial dress, while on the other side was a green-haired being with a square head and a thin yet lethal-looking man. Both sides were glowering at the opposing duo with enmity in their eyes. The elderly man was none other than the native cultivator with the Yan surname, and his expression remained calm as he said, "Don't you think you're being too unreasonable by trying to kick us out when you two arrived after us?" The green-haired being was the foreign being at the pinnacle of the spatial tempering stage that had been crushed by Han Li earlier, and he let loose a cold harumph as he countered, "HMPH, this place has caught my fancy, and I want to be able to explore it without anyone lurking outside." "You're going too far. We were the ones who found this place first, so why do we have to leave?" the woman retorted in a furious manner. "Why, among cultivators like us, the most powerful one gets to make all the rules. If you don't want to leave, then defeat us and we'll leave the valley to you. Otherwise, piss off." The green-haired being scoffed as a baleful aura emanated from his body, as if he were preparing for a battle already. "There's no need to be so short-tempered, fellow Taoist. Let's be honest here. You two want us to leave naturally because your formation plates have also displayed a reaction toward this valley. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that the immortal Xianxia is in here. We've encountered similar red herrings on many occasions in the past few days, and I'm sure you have as well. As such, why don't we go in together and ascertain whether the immortal Xianxia is actually in there before making a decision? Otherwise, there's no way we're going to leave," the elderly man proposed in a calm manner.